Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Story 1. How medieval Russians insulated log houses with moss. Imagine you are standing at the edge of a thick, damp forest in northern Rus, somewhere in the 13th century. The air is cool even in late spring, and the canopy filters the sunlight into scattered, lazy patches. You hear axes striking in slow, rhythmic succession, deep, resonant thuds as iron meets pine. This is not a battlefield. There are no swords, no shouts. Just men in homespun linen shirts, cutting trees, slowly and methodically, in preparation for building a home. Their houses are not framed. They are hewn from whole logs, scribed and stacked. In this time, most people never leave their village. A good house is a multi-generational investment, a shelter against brutal winters, against wolves, and sometimes against other humans. And yet, the construction itself is a deeply local act. No nails, no metal fasteners, just interlocking logs, tools passed down generations, and one often overlooked material: moss. The role of wood in Rus society. Medieval Russians lived in the forest. Not metaphorically, they lived in it. The vast, endless taiga was more than backdrop. It was the source of fuel, housing, tools, traps, sledges, and in colder regions, even coffins made in advance. The forest was both comfort and danger. Firewood meant survival, but the wolves came close in winter. Trees were not just trees. Pine, spruce, fir, birch all had distinct personalities and uses. Pine for logs, birch for bark and fine work, spruce for resin. Aspen, often avoided for its supposed unclean associations, still found use in certain situations. And then there was moss. Chinking the cracks, a quiet innovation. When logs are stacked to make a wall, they do not fit perfectly. Even the best-fitted scribe-fit corner joints will leave long horizontal cracks between the logs. These gaps leak cold air in winter, warm air in summer, and worse, moisture, insects, and rodents. The solution was simple, abundant, and surprisingly effective: sphagnum moss. Soft, fibrous, and mildly antiseptic, this moss grew in abundance in the boggy understory of northern forests. It was gathered by hand, often by women and children in the early part of summer, long before house construction began. Bundled and dried, it was stored in sacks, then pressed tightly into the spaces between logs using wooden paddles or chisels. Over time, the moss would expand slightly, filling voids. It also absorbed moisture, preventing rot, while its acidity discouraged pests. As houses settled over years and decades, more moss could be pressed in during routine maintenance, an annual or biennial ritual in many households. It was neither glamorous nor fast. It was simply effective. Building the izba without blueprints. The Russian peasant house known as the izba was built without formal plans. Generations of knowledge passed through hands, not books. First, the logs were stripped of bark, then sometimes left to season. 4 main walls were laid with interlocking corner notches. The logs themselves could be shaped with axes, adzes, and a long-bladed drawknife known as a stamska. The moss was packed in during the build, 1 layer of moss between each log. A house might require hundreds of kilograms of it, and it had to be just the right kind, green and fresh when gathered, but dry and pliable when used. Each wall had to be aligned just so. A poorly built izba meant suffering, sickness, or death. Cold drafts could lead to frostbite in infants. Excess humidity could rot stored grain, and a poorly mossed house might invite mice, or worse, into the sleeping quarters. Yet the process was not loud. There was no hammering, no shouts of architects, just wood, tools, hands, and moss. A women's task, a community's shelter. While men typically felled and shaped logs, the gathering and installation of moss was often managed by women. It was slow work, done in silence or with songs. Elders taught girls how to select the right species of moss, preferably the long-fibered kind that clung together without falling apart. Other kinds could be too brittle or too absorbent, risking mold or collapse. They would walk into the marshlands barefoot, skirts tied up, fingers stained green, gathering what looked like weeds to an outsider. But to them, it was insulation, bedding, and medicine. The act of filling the log joints with moss was as intimate as it was mundane. They would press it tightly, then carefully smooth the outer edges with flat sticks. These details mattered. Poor chinking meant cold nights. A well-mossed wall meant peace of mind. The smell of time, living in the mossed izba. Inside an izba, especially in winter, the smell was unmistakable, a mix of smoke, wood, and moss. The moss gave off a faint, earthy scent, especially when humid. In a corner, a clay stove might crackle with birchwood. Walls exhaled warmth slowly, the moss gently preventing loss. Moss was also packed around window frames, behind doors, and sometimes used in bedding for livestock. In the spring, if the moss became dislodged or decayed, it was replaced, gathered anew, stuffed with care. People slept on wooden benches by the stove. Grandmothers whispered old songs. Children itched at the fibers in their bedding. The walls did not speak, but they remembered. And still the question lingers. Why moss? Why not clay or straw or fabric? The answer lies not just in availability, but in survival. What made moss so uniquely effective in this cold, remote world? And what other quiet, forgotten materials helped people endure in places where winter could last half the year? When we left off, we were inside a medieval Russian izba, a log home sealed with moss and warmed by a central clay stove. A place where the smells of pine resin and fire lingered in the corners, where moss lined the cracks, and life depended on details most people today would overlook. The question remains, why moss? Not just from a practical sense, but culturally, why did this unassuming plant come to define the very idea of shelter in the frozen north? To answer that, we need to step beyond the walls and into the rhythms of life that demanded such materials not just once, during construction, but repeatedly, through repair, maintenance, and renewal. The practical science of moss in log construction. The decision to use moss was not rooted in modern insulation theory, yet it aligns with many principles understood today. Moss, particularly sphagnum species, has a high moisture-holding capacity while also maintaining air pockets within its fibrous structure. This makes it an excellent thermal insulator. It absorbs humidity without rotting easily, and because of its slight acidity, it resists fungal growth, especially important in a world without chemical preservatives or modern ventilation systems. In places like Novgorod or the White Sea coast, where the climate demanded airtight, dry dwellings for survival, moss was more than convenient, it was ideal. But it wasn't just used between logs. In some households, it served as bedding for animals. In others, it lined root cellars or was packed into cracks in the floor. In emergencies, it could be used for bandaging wounds, its mild antiseptic properties recognized by local herbalists centuries before Western medicine caught on. In short, moss was a material of continuity, linking survival across the home, the body, and the environment. The annual ritual of moss renewal. Once the izba was built, the job was far from over. Each year, particularly in spring and early summer, the house demanded attention. Snowmelt and ice would loosen the moss packed between logs. Rodents sometimes burrowed into the outer layers. Children, curious and clumsy, might pick at it, not realizing their mischief allowed in the cold. Thus, families developed a ritual around mossing day, or sometimes several days. Women and children would revisit the swamps or forest edges, collecting moss in baskets. The men would scrape out the damaged portions with wooden chisels, clearing space for new material. This work was done slowly, not rushed. There was a quiet respect for the home as a living, breathing thing. Even the tools reflected this. Mashatka, a narrow wooden paddle used for pushing moss into tight spaces. Some had decorative carvings. Some were passed down through families. These weren't mass-produced. They were handmade, intimate objects like the home itself. In more prosperous villages, a house might even be remossed with two types: coarse moss for the base, fine moss for the outer layer. The aesthetics mattered, but so did the performance. A well-sealed wall could mean the difference between comfort and frostbite. Moss as a marker of poverty or ingenuity. Over time, particularly by the 18th and 19th centuries, outsiders began to look at moss chinking as primitive. Stone houses, clay brick, lime plaster, these became signs of progress. Moss, by contrast, was rustic. Peasant technology, a sign of poverty or backwardness. But this overlooks the sophistication of the choice. In regions where other materials were scarce or expensive, moss allowed complete, thermally efficient construction with local resources and minimal labor. There was no dependence on merchants or quarries. No need to transport materials over rivers or roads, just axe, hands, and patience. And moss's insulation value was measurable. Researchers in the 20th century, investigating traditional building techniques in Siberia, confirmed that properly mossed log walls could retain heat nearly as efficiently as modern wood frame walls with fiberglass insulation. The key was not just the material, but the method: how tightly it was packed, how carefully the joints were sealed. So while moss may have been humble, it was also ingenious. It was local knowledge applied with care, a kind of embodied wisdom often ignored in elite historical narratives. The moss economy: trade, craft, and craftiness. Although moss grew freely in the forest, not all moss was the same. Some species were more elastic, others more fibrous. Dry moss was more brittle and harder to work with. Fresh moss could be too wet. In some regions, communities began to trade moss, especially in times of shortage or when building booms overwhelmed local supply. Women might gather excess during the summer and store it in woven sacks, later selling it at village markets in small bundles. These bundles were light, but bulky, difficult to transport long distances. For this reason, they rarely made it far beyond the forest zones, which further rooted moss chinking in a specifically northern, forested geography. In other places, individuals developed reputations as skilled mossers. They could be hired to pack the gaps in a newly built izba, a job requiring a precise hand and an intuitive sense of where drafts might develop. Thus, even this boring element of house construction had its microeconomy, its specialists, its know-how. The cultural memory of moss. Beyond utility, moss became embedded in folklore and seasonal rhythms. Children were warned not to pull it out or they'd let winter in. Stories told of forest spirits who lived in the moss beds, watching those who harvested too greedily. In some parts of northern Rus, it was customary to leave a small piece of moss at the forest's edge, a kind of offering for what had been taken. In lullabies and work songs, moss appeared symbolically associated with patience, hidden strength, or maternal warmth. The idea of tucking someone in like moss in a log became a metaphor for care. And then there were the healing uses: moss boiled in water for washing wounds, dried moss tucked into shoes for extra warmth, even moss tea, though bitter, consumed during illness or fasting periods. Moss wasn't just a construction material, it was a cultural touchstone, woven into stories, survival strategies, and daily life. The vanishing of the mossed izba. By the late 19th century, as industrialization crept into the Russian countryside, many of these moss-based practices began to fade. New building materials, bricks, cement, processed lumber offered different options. Metal nails replaced wooden pegs. Sawmills produced standardized beams that didn't shrink as much or require the same kind of chinking. And yet many communities resisted the change, not out of conservatism but out of practicality. Moss was free. Bricks were not. And in cold, remote regions, the old ways worked. Still, during the Soviet period, traditional izbas were often labeled relics, even as they remained widely used. State housing replaced them in many areas. Moss was dismissed as obsolete until environmental and heritage researchers in the late 20th century began to reevaluate its value. Today, in parts of rural Russia, you can still find izbas insulated with moss, especially among older generations. Some have stood for 100 years, their walls resting on stone footings, their joints still tight, their moss a little faded but still there. But will these homes survive modernization? And what does the decline of mossed architecture tell us about the shifting balance between tradition, sustainability, and efficiency? The story of moss and wood is, at its heart, a story about time. Time spent building, gathering, packing, repairing. Time spent surviving through long, punishing winters where the difference between life and death was measured not in days, but in degrees. And time now past, where the quiet wisdom of moss-filled joints slowly fades from memory, like smoke from the chimney of an abandoned izba. But some things linger. In the grain of old logs, in the smell of pine tar, in the green traces between ancient timbers, moss still tells a story, even if few are left to listen. The aging izba, a living artifact. Step inside an izba that has stood for 80, maybe 100 years. Its corners are dark with soot, and the floorboards creak with every step. The stove sits in its rightful place, a towering masonry heart of the home, where meals were cooked and bodies warmed through months of snow. If the house has been maintained, you'll still see moss in the chinks between the logs. Sometimes it peeks out in dry, papery tufts. Other times it's green and damp, having absorbed decades of condensation and cold. It may smell earthy, like a forest floor, or faintly acidic if it's sphagnum. Some of it was replaced by hand. Other portions were left as is, undisturbed. And though the logs may shift and the foundation settle, the moss holds on. Because that's what moss does, it holds. It binds, it cushions, it fills the forgotten spaces others overlook. And for many older Russians, the sight of moss between logs isn't quaint or rustic. It's a symbol of continuity, a reminder of when people built what they needed from what they had and made it last as long as humanly possible. Echoes in modern eco-building. Ironically, as modern architecture moves toward sustainability and natural design, some of the old ways dismissed for decades have resurfaced in new contexts. In green building circles, natural insulation materials have regained attention. Sheep's wool, hempcrete, even moss. Some log home builders in Northern Europe and Russia still use moss not because they lack alternatives, but because moss breathes with the wood. Unlike synthetic foams or fiberglass, moss allows vapor to pass while still insulating effectively. It expands and contracts with the seasons. It doesn't trap water, it manages it. There are even reports of Scandinavian designers exploring moss walls for interior humidity regulation. They cite the same properties that medieval Russian builders relied on: thermal stability, antibacterial qualities, biodegradability. Of course, the process has changed. Where a woman once sat on a wooden bench packing moss into crevices with a carved paddle, now machines compress mats of it for commercial application. Yet the principle endures. The wisdom, even if uncredited, remains. Rituals of repair, memory, and maintenance. There is something profoundly human about the act of maintenance, caring for a structure, year after year, knowing that perfection is neither possible nor the goal. The izba was never finished. Even on the day it was built, its aging had already begun. And moss was part of that rhythm. It invited attention, required it even. It didn't hide decay, it made it visible and thus manageable. Children learned to moss from watching their elders. Hands-on, tactile learning. A memory passed through fingertips, not textbooks. There were no how-to manuals for mossing. You learned by doing, by fixing, by quietly sensing the draft or the dampness and knowing what needed to be done. Even today, among elderly residents of northern villages, the act of adding moss is not just a task. It is a ritual, a way to say, "This house is alive, I'm still here." It's still here. We're still holding each other up. The cultural image of the izba. In Russian literature and folk art, the izba holds a special place. Often depicted as the humble home of the wise peasant, the widowed grandmother, or the quiet survivor on the edge of a great forest, it becomes more than a building. It becomes a symbol of rootedness. The Baba Yaga of folklore famously lives in a magical izba on chicken legs, a grotesque exaggeration. But even that mythical home is made of logs, covered in moss, hidden in trees, a place both inviting and dangerous. In more grounded tales, the izba is the setting of domestic wisdom, where bread is kneaded, where tales are told by candlelight, where shoes dry near the stove. It is where generations sleep side by side through dark winters. And even as urbanization transformed Russian life, the image of the mossed izba remained powerful. Soviet-era painters often portrayed it as nostalgic or romanticized, yet for many, it was simply home. Lessons from a house of moss. So what can this tell us, those of us far removed from medieval ruse, who no longer build with axes or gather moss in the spring? Perhaps it tells us that human survival has always depended not just on bold innovation, but on quiet adaptation, on noticing, on learning what a place offers and listening to what it needs. The people who built with moss did not think of themselves as conservationists or engineers. They were simply trying to stay warm, to live through the season, to protect their families, and they did so by using what grew at their feet, what fit between the gaps. In a world increasingly reliant on complex systems, plastic, steel, synthetic insulation, factory-made everything, the story of moss in the izba offers a different kind of wisdom. That sometimes the best solution is the one that grows silently, patiently, and unnoticed in the woods nearby. A thought before we leave this house. There is a Russian proverb: the forest is a home to those who know it. The moss, the logs, the chinking tool, these were not advanced technologies, yet they were advanced in understanding. They reveal a kind of intelligence that doesn't shout. It survives. It remembers. It cushions the hard places and fills the cold spaces. And so we close the door on this first story, leaving the izba standing, its walls packed with green, its stove still warm, its silence full of memory. But it lingers, doesn't it? The moss, the touch, the act of hands pressing it into place. In the noise of modern life, are there things, quiet, boring things we've stopped noticing, but which once kept us alive? Story 2, the brickmakers of Tudor London, soot, sweat, and survival. You are standing in the outskirts of London, somewhere along the Thames, during the reign of Henry VIII. The city is not yet the sprawling metropolis it will become. The skyline is low and wooden. Smoke rises in lazy curls from thatched rooftops. The air smells faintly of damp earth, coal smoke, and human waste. It is a city in transition, growing, burning, rebuilding. But beneath your feet, hidden just beneath the thin crust of grass and gravel, lies something critical. London clay, a dense, sticky, grayish substance that, in the hands of the right people, becomes one of the most important materials of the Tudor era: brick. In an age when plague, fire, and the rot of timber threatened every structure, brick was not just a building material, it was a strategy for survival. But someone had to make it, and that someone was often anonymous, filthy, and bone-tired. This is the story of those people. The transition from timber to brick. In the early 16th century, most homes in London were still built from timber. Oak beams, wattle and daub walls, and thatched roofs were the standard. But these materials came with problems. Timber rotted. It burned easily. Rats nested in thatch. Worse, timber was becoming scarce as forests were felled for fuel and shipbuilding. The wealthy began to look toward something more durable. Brick, though labor-intensive, offered permanence. The fire of 1212 had already reminded Londoners of the dangers of wood. Brick houses didn't ignite like tinderboxes. They didn't collapse from fungus in the walls. They stood still, year after year. Henry VIII himself began favoring brick for palaces. Hampton Court, for example, was built from over 2 million bricks. The fashion spread among the nobility, then the gentry. Eventually, even merchants wanted brick facades, if not whole houses. But all of that depended on someone's digging, shaping, drying, and firing clay, day in, day out. A brickmaker's life, more earth than flesh. The life of a Tudor brickmaker was not romantic. It was muddy, grueling, and seasonal. Most brickmakers lived and worked on the city's fringes south of the Thames, in places like Southwark, or along the riverbank where clay deposits were thick, and the smoke from brick kilns wouldn't bother the rich. The season began in early spring, as soon as the ground softened. Men, sometimes whole families, dug up the clay with long-handled shovels, breaking through the frost and exposing the dense, wet layers beneath. The clay was sticky, difficult to extract, and heavy. It had to be trampled or needed wedged, as they called it, by foot or spade to remove stones and roots. This was not clean work. You stood ankle-deep in cold sludge, your feet raw, your hands cracked. No gloves, no boots, no compensation for injury. And if your back gave out, there was always another man or child to take your place. After the clay was prepared, it was shaped by hand in wooden molds. A handful of sand was thrown into the mold to prevent sticking. Then clay was slapped in, pressed smooth, and scraped flat with a wire or stick. The brick was gently knocked out, set aside, and left to dry in the open air for several days. If it rained, bricks warped or cracked. If it was too dry, they dried too quickly and shattered in the kiln. 1,000 things could go wrong, and yet somehow millions of bricks were made each year. The fires of London's kilns. Once dried, bricks were fired in temporary clamp kilns, long, low heaps of green bricks stacked with layers of coal or wood between them. A well-built clamp might hold 20,000 bricks or more. It was then covered with a clay and turf skin to hold in heat and protect from rain. The firing process lasted over a week. A fire was lit at one end and gradually worked its way through the clamp. The entire mass glowed red-hot, reaching temperatures high enough to vitrify the clay. When done right, the bricks were hard, weatherproof, and suitable for London's damp climate. But clamp kilns were unpredictable. The outer bricks often burned too hot, called clinkers, while the inner ones remained under-fired and crumbly. Good brickmakers developed a sixth sense for the fire, listening to the draft, watching the color of smoke, tapping bricks with sticks to judge their sound. And all the while, smoke blackened their lungs. Their clothes reeked of soot. Their skin cracked from heat and clay dust. These men, mostly invisible in the records of the time, kept London standing. The cost of a brick. In 1538, the cost of 1,000 bricks in London was about 5 shillings. For comparison, a skilled mason might earn 1 to 2 shillings a day. Brickmakers earned less. A common brick house required tens of thousands of bricks. The wealthy commissioned diaper patterns decorative brickwork with blackened bricks in diamond or zigzag designs. These weren't made by the brickmakers, but they had to supply the bricks, still uniform, still durable. Some brickmakers worked for large operations. Others were itinerant, traveling with molds and spades, building clamp kilns near a site, making bricks from local clay. These free burners lived rough, camped by fields or woods, often barely scraping by. And yet the city depended on them. Children in the clay. Many brickmakers' families worked together. Children carried clay or fetched water. Women often loaded bricks into drying sheds or sorted usable bricks from warped rejects. The work was hazardous. Clay pits collapsed, kilns exploded, smoke choked the air. Few brickmakers lived long. Their names do not appear in the guild records or royal accounts. They didn't build palaces, they built for them. Yet without them there would be no walls, no arches, no chimneys to carry the smoke away from Tudor hearths. A changing city. By the end of the Tudor period, London was growing faster than ever. Fires continued to plague its neighborhoods. In 1580 alone, more than 150 houses burned in one blaze. The need for brick surged. City ordinances began requiring brick or tile construction in certain districts. Bricklayers formed guilds. Wealthy patrons imported bricks or paid premiums for fine red bricks from Essex or Kent. But the brickmakers, the ones knee-deep in cold clay, remained invisible, paid by the thousand, replaced easily, seldom remembered. They didn't seek legacy. They sought warmth, food, and rest. Still, as you walk London streets today, beneath the plaster and paint, behind the facades those bricks remain, fired clay, touched by forgotten hands. And so we ask, in a city built on fame and fortune, how much of its foundation rests on the backs of the anonymous poor? We met the nameless brickmakers whose calloused hands shaped London's skyline, one pressed lump of clay at a time. Their lives were messy, anonymous, and grueling. Yet they fueled a quiet revolution in urban survival, a shift from timber to brick in a city where fire, disease, and decay had long been the norm. Now let us step further into the kiln's shadow and explore how brickmaking shaped not just structures, but power, control, and the very politics of permanence in Tudor London. The Crown and the Kiln, Henry VII's bricks. To the eye of a Tudor monarch, brick was more than building material, it was political theater. When Henry VIII began commissioning bricks for Hampton Court Palace in the 1520s, he wasn't just building a home, he was building a statement. Brick had a continental flair. The Dutch and Flemish used it extensively in cities like Bruges and Ghent. Brickwork with patterns, ornamentation, and precision joints hinted at order, wealth, and restraint, traits a king might wish to project. But it wasn't just about looks. Brick meant durability. It could withstand siege, flame, and time. So Henry ordered millions. An estimated 2.5 to 3 million bricks were made for Hampton Court alone, most of them pressed, dried, and fired within a few miles of the site. Unlike timber, bricks could be made in mass. They did not require aged oak or long transport by cart, but they did require labor, a lot of it. To meet royal demands, brickmaking camps sprouted up on palace grounds. Hundreds of laborers, likely unpaid serfs, day laborers, and craftsmen under duress dug clay from pits, molded bricks under harsh discipline, and kept kilns burning day and night. These workers were often temporary and disposable, yet their work built a palace still standing 500 years later. The rise of regulations, brick, fire, and fear. As London grew, so did its vulnerabilities. Fire was a constant threat. The narrow, timber-lined streets were a labyrinth of flammable material. A single spark could reduce entire neighborhoods to ash, as happened repeatedly throughout the 16th century. In response, authorities began to regulate building materials. As early as 1583, the city issued proclamations requiring new structures in certain districts to be constructed of brick or stone. These mandates had cascading effects. Demand for bricks surged. Kilns multiplied along the outskirts of town. Brickfields became fixtures of the urban fringe. Smoke rose daily from South London, Hackney, Stepney, anywhere with clay and space. Local brickmakers gained leverage. While still poor and often exploited, brickmakers now held something the city needed. They were not organized in powerful guilds like stonemasons or carpenters, but their role became more essential. Some landlords and developers tried to lock in exclusive contracts with brickmakers. Others imported bricks by river to meet building timelines. Pollution increased. Kilns burned coal or wood, belching thick black smoke. Residents complained, but still the kilns fired because bricks meant progress, and progress meant survival. Brick by brick, class divides in construction. In Tudor London, not all bricks were equal. The rich built with face bricks uniform in shape, often red. sometimes darkened intentionally for contrast. These were carefully sorted and laid in visible layers. The rest of the structure, the hidden bones of the building, could be made with stock bricks, more irregular, often yellowish or underfired. Bricklayers became more specialized. Some worked only with face brick, others only with mortar preparation. But behind the masons stood the invisible brigade of brickmakers, producing tens of thousands of bricks per month. They earned a fraction of what the bricklayers earned. Even in materials, class lines were drawn. The bricks used for chimneys and facades were treated, cleaned, sometimes even rubbed or polished. But the bricks used in privies, cellars, and back alleys were raw and unrefined like the hands that made them. And so the city stratified, brick by brick, in both design and labor. The brickfields, between the city and the marsh. If you wandered the edges of Tudor London, especially to the south and east, you'd find the brickfields. These weren't formal factories or permanent workshops. They were sprawling open-air production zones, seasonal, temporary, and brutal. A brickfield might last a few years, until the clay ran out or the smoke drew too many complaints. Workers lived on-site in makeshift huts, often surrounded by heaps of coal, discarded brick shards, and piles of drying clay. Life in the brickfields was short and harsh. Sanitation was poor. Workers relieved themselves in nearby woods or ditches. Accidents were common, kilns collapsed, children slipped into clay pits. Disease spread easily, water was contaminated, medical care was non-existent. Pay was irregular, often tied to output, how many bricks you molded, fired, or stacked. If the weather turned, you earned nothing. Yet people came, because even miserable work was better than no work, and the city needed more bricks every day. Women in the clay. While men dominated the kiln and clay pit, women were not absent from brickmaking. They often handled the light tasks, moving drying bricks, gathering sand, cleaning molds, stacking bricks for sale. Widows and daughters sometimes inherited brick molding skills. In rare cases, they even ran small operations. The records are sparse, but wills and parish rolls reveal names. Agnes Burkett, widow and brickburner, appears in a 1592 inventory from Kent. Women's labor, as usual, went largely uncredited, but without it, the brickfields would have slowed, if not stalled entirely. The river trade, moving bricks by water. As London's demand for bricks expanded beyond what local clay could supply, merchants turned to river transport. Flat-bottomed barges carried bricks from Essex, Kent, and further inland along the Thames. These were often better-fired bricks, more uniform and easier to stack. They fetched higher prices in the London market. Porters unloaded bricks at the docks. Cartmen hauled them through the city's narrow streets. And all along the way, people profited, except, usually, the brickmakers themselves. A job for the forgotten. In the end, brickmaking remained what it had always been, a job for the marginal, for the landless laborer, the sickly veteran, the orphaned child, for those too poor for apprenticeship and too strong to beg. There were no monuments to brickmakers, no saints of clay, yet the city rested on their output. Without them, there would be no Guildhall, no rebuilt bridges, no chimneys to keep the air breathable in winter. They shaped the very bones of the city, even as the city forgot their names. A city stacked with ghosts. Today, the bricks of Tudor London are buried under centuries of stone and steel. But they remain, in cellars, chimneys, and foundations, soft red blocks, pitted by time, still bearing fingerprints pressed into the clay 500 years ago. If you pry one loose and look closely, you may find a mark, a thumb, a scrape, a tool line, a signature of the unseen. So what else is built upon the labor we choose not to remember? By now, you know the feel of cold clay underfoot, the sting of smoke in the eyes, and the weight of countless bricks pressed and stacked by weary hands. Brickmakers, the forgotten laborers of Tudor London, stood on the edge of society, quite literally shaping its foundations. But even as the city rose higher and wider, even as chimneys pierced the skyline and fireproofing became a mandate, the men and women who made it possible remained mired in the same cycles of poverty. Their story doesn't end with a moment of triumph. It ends where it began, in the margins, in the mud, in the slow erosion of memory. The Great Fire of London, a pyre for the past. In 1666, decades after the Tudor period, London burned again. This time, the Great Fire would change the city forever. Over 13,000 buildings were destroyed in just 4 days. Narrow timber alleys, roof lines stuffed with kindling, and jetted upper stories created a furnace that consumed all in its path. Ironically, the very materials the city had begun to abandon, timber, thatch, wattle, fueled the flames. And it was brick that would ultimately promise protection. In the fire's aftermath, King Charles II issued a royal proclamation. New buildings must be made of brick or stone. Timber was to be minimized, jetted stories banned. London was to become a fireproof city. This moment cemented brick's legacy as the fabric of urban survival. But by then, many of the Tudor-era brickmakers were long gone, buried beneath the clay fields they once worked. Their labor, invisible and uncelebrated, had foreshadowed the change by more than a century. The standard brick and the lost touch. By the 17th century, England moved toward standardization of bricks. Before this, there had been no fixed size. Each region and each brickmaker used slightly different molds. This made construction complicated, especially when transporting bricks from one region to another. The London stock brick, with a nominal size of around 9x 4.5x 2.75 inches, became the model. It was efficient, easy to handle, and fired to a buff yellow finish when made with local clay. But with standardization came loss. Loss of regional variation. The red bricks of Norfolk, the soft browns of Sussex, the darker clays of Kent, all began to blur together. Loss of individual imprint. Fewer bricks bore thumbprints, trowel marks, or the subtle inconsistencies that once revealed their maker. And perhaps most profoundly, a loss of the sense that brickmaking was a craft, not just production. As kilns became more efficient and mechanized, the hand-shaping of bricks faded. By the 18th century, factory production began to rise. The field brickmaker, once a muddy fixture of the city's fringe, was being replaced by faster, cheaper, and less visible systems. The ghosts beneath the surface. Yet even centuries later, traces of these anonymous laborers remain. Urban archaeologists excavating beneath London's modern foundations routinely uncover Tudor-era bricks. Some are warped, others bear initials scratched with sticks. A few have child-sized fingerprints pressed into their sides, frozen in time. In one site near Southwark, bricks were discovered with animal hair still embedded in the clay used to temper the mix and strengthen the bond. In another, a cluster of bricks was found haphazardly stacked in what appeared to be a collapsed clamp kiln, perhaps abandoned mid-burn, or left after an accident. These fragments tell a story no ledger ever recorded. They are artifacts of exhaustion, of adaptation, of human effort poured into structures that no longer exist. The houses are gone, but the bricks remain. Brick as memory. To walk through the remaining Tudor districts of London, where they exist, is to walk through layers of labor. The red brick wings of Hampton Court, the scattered remains of brick walls in East London, the buried cellars that survived the Great Fire, each hold the memory of a person who bent over a mold, slapped in wet clay, and shaped the city without ever owning a piece of it. The paradox is clear. Those who built the city could not afford to live in it. Those who gave it permanence had none themselves. The walls held firm. Their names crumbled away. Today, we rarely think about bricks at all. We see walls, facades, straight lines. We forget that each brick was once part of the earth, and that someone, usually poor, usually nameless, put it there. In that sense, bricks are a record, not of events but of effort. They are small, rectangular monuments to invisible labor. Reflections in modern light. In recent years, some scholars and restoration architects have begun to revalue historic brickwork. Hand-pressed bricks are prized for their texture, color variation, and character. Old clamp firing techniques are studied for their sustainability. The crookedness, once seen as imperfection, is now viewed as charm. Yet this revival often lacks connection to the people behind the bricks. The aesthetic is celebrated, the hardship is not. So what if we saw bricks differently? What if we recognized that beneath every red line in a Georgian terrace, every Tudor arch or chimney stack, lies a hidden thumbprint, a signature of labor we were never meant to notice? And what might we owe those who left no names, but left behind millions of bricks? Closing the kiln. Let's return one last time to the brick field. The fire has died down. The kiln is a blackened husk. Bricks lie in neat rows, cooling in the morning air. The workers have left. Their tools are leaning in the grass. The clay pit, now still, reflects the sky like a muddy mirror. There is no applause, no monument, just a stack of red blocks waiting to become someone else's future. And so ends the story of the Tudor brickmakers, builders of a city, strangers to its memory. But the next time you see a wall of old bricks, think of the soot, the sweat, the survival. And ask yourself, how many of history's foundations were built by hands we've chosen to forget? Story 3. Carving ice in 19th century New England. Winter's forgotten trade. Picture a frozen lake at dawn. The surface stretches wide and silent, white with frost and a dusting of snow. The trees along the bank stand brittle and still. There is no wind, only the sound of iron cleats scraping across the ice and the rhythmic thud of saws biting deep into the surface. This is Massachusetts in January, sometime in the 1850s. You are watching men harvest one of the most critical commodities of the 19th century: ice. Solid, translucent slabs of frozen water, cut from ponds and lakes, loaded onto sleds, and hauled away to be stored and shipped around the world. This is not a side job or a curiosity. This is a massive industry, one that employed thousands, powered entire shipping fleets, and shaped the diets and economies of cities far beyond the American Northeast. It is also almost completely forgotten today. Let us begin with the cold, with the lake, and with the men who knew its surface better than they knew dry land. The birth of an unusual industry. Before the age of electricity, refrigeration was impossible. Perishables spoiled quickly, and food was heavily salted, dried, smoked, or pickled to keep it edible. There was no such thing as a cold drink in summer unless it came straight from a mountain spring. That changed in the early 1800s when a Boston businessman named Frederick Tudor had a simple but radical idea. What if ice could be cut from New England lakes and shipped to hot climates? At first, people laughed. Ice melts, after all. But Tudor figured out how to insulate it, first with straw and sawdust, later with tightly packed wooden crates and layered transport. His first shipments went to the Caribbean. They arrived smaller but solid. Over time, his enterprise expanded. By the mid-19th century, he was sending ice to India, South America, and the American South. He became known as the Ice King. But behind Tudor's success was a growing workforce of ice harvesters, whose labor made it possible. These were not inventors or businessmen. They were farmers, laborers, and seasonal workers. Their job was simple to describe and brutally hard to do: carve frozen lakes into cubes and move them by hand to massive ice houses before they could melt. Preparing the lake, measuring, clearing, waiting. The ice harvest was short and precise. It depended entirely on weather. Too thin, and the ice would crack and drown a man. Too thick, and it was harder to cut and haul. The ideal depth was 10 to 18 inches, thick enough to be solid, thin enough to manage. Work began long before cutting. Crews used horses and plows to clear snow from the ice, allowing the cold to penetrate deeper. They marked the surface into grids with iron markers, long parallel lines scratched into the frozen lake, forming a kind of field for cutting. This part of the job was quiet, repetitive, and deeply cold. Temperatures regularly dipped below zero. Men wore wool coats stiff with frost and their beards froze solid. Still, they worked. Because once the ice was ready, the clock began ticking. One warm spell could ruin everything. Tools of the ice trade. The basic tool of the harvester was the ice saw, a long, coarse-toothed blade with a wooden handle. Cutting a single block by hand could take several minutes, and it was easy to slip. The surface was slick, and the saw kicked back if you hit an air pocket. As the industry grew, innovations followed. Horse-drawn cutters, bladed sleds that carved grooves into the ice, making hand cutting easier. Ice hooks, long-handled tools with a curved metal claw, used to grip and drag heavy blocks. Tongs and levers, essential for lifting ice from water onto sleds or platforms. Conveyor ramps. In later years, mechanical lifts helped move ice from the shore to ice houses. But in the 1840s and 50s, much of the work was still manual, with teams of men cutting, lifting, and dragging blocks weighing 200 to 300 pounds apiece. The ice block, a simple commodity carefully made. Each block of ice had to be uniform, roughly 22 inches by 32 inches by 12 inches, depending on the lake and the machinery available. Why so specific? Because stacking mattered. Ice melted faster if uneven or if air flowed through gaps in the storage pile. Perfect blocks fit snugly together. Air was the enemy. Close backing combined with sawdust insulation kept the ice stable for months even in transit. Some blocks were scored and split, not entirely cut through. Workers would score long lines, then use chisels to crack the block cleanly, like breaking glass. It was dangerous work. A single misstep could drop you into freezing water. Some men wore rope harnesses, but many did not. The job paid by output, not safety. The ice house, cold castles by the shore. Once cut, the blocks were slid across the ice or hauled by horse-drawn sledges to the edge of the lake, where towering wooden structures waited. Ice houses. These were simple in design, thick wooden walls lined with sawdust, no windows, and a central chute for stacking ice. Some were large enough to hold 20,000 tons of ice at once. Workers would pass blocks up ramps or conveyor belts, stacking them layer by layer, tamping sawdust into every gap. A well-stocked ice house could hold through summer. In fact, 30–50% of the stored ice was expected to melt. The rest was profit. For the workers, this was the most punishing part of the job. It was wet, slippery, and exhausting. The interior of an ice house was bitterly cold. Hands went numb quickly. Splinters, frostbite, and back injuries were common. But when the doors were shut and the last blocks laid, there was a moment of triumph. The harvest was in. The cold had been captured. The ice, in its silence, would now wait for summer. An unseen necessity. The ice harvest may sound exotic today, but in the 19th century, it was as routine as wheat or lumber. Ice enabled butchers to store meat, breweries to keep beer cool, and cities to transport milk without spoilage. It gave people ice cream in July and cool drinks in August. In Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, daily deliveries of ice were as normal as bread. A family might receive a 25-pound block each morning, placed in their icebox. And none of that would have been possible without men hauling frozen slabs from lakes in January. A cold gamble. Not every winter was kind. Some years the ice was too thin. Others it came late or melted early. Companies gambled on nature. If the harvest failed, there was no backup. Ice couldn't be conjured. Entire supply chains collapsed. Prices soared. Spoilage followed. In this way, the ice harvest was an early lesson in climate dependency, a system finely balanced on weather and labor. And yet few people thought about it. Ice simply appeared like magic in boxes and wagons. The question beneath the frost. So here we are at the edge of the lake. The men work in silence. The horses snort clouds into the frozen air. The lake is a grid of white lines waiting to be carved. A city hundreds of miles away waits for its ice. There are no engines, no compressors, no cold coils or refrigerants. Just a saw, a sled, and a season. And so we ask, how did an entire world come to depend on something as fragile as a winter freeze? We've seen how ice was harvested cut in clean, rectangular blocks from frozen lakes by men working with saws, hooks, and horse-drawn sleds. They battled frostbite, fatigue, and the ever-looming unpredictability of winter's thaw. But once the ice blocks were packed into towering, sawdust-filled ice houses, the next part of the journey began. Because ice wasn't meant to stay in Massachusetts. It was destined for New York, Charleston, Cuba, Calcutta, and Rio de Janeiro. And shipping ice, a material that melts, was perhaps the most audacious logistical operation of the 19th century. The ice house's warehouse. After the harvest came months of silence. The lakes thawed, the tools were stored, and the ice houses stood like mute fortresses by the water. Inside, stacked in meticulous layers, the ice slowly surrendered to time, melting just enough to be noticed, but not enough to matter. A well-packed ice house, insulated with sawdust or even rice husks, could hold ice solid through the summer and even longer. In some places, blocks harvested in February were still usable in October. In colder regions, some lasted until the next winter harvest. Ice houses near ports such as in Boston's Charlestown or Maine's Kennebec River served as distribution centers. As soon as shipping season opened, the ice began its second journey, by wagon, barge, and steamship to the cities of the world. The ice trade goes global. Frederick Tudor, the so-called Ice King, transformed a local harvest into an international business empire. His ships carried ice to Cuba, where it was sold to sugar plantation owners and hotel kitchens. New Orleans, where it cooled meat markets and sweetened drinks. India, where a British garrison in Calcutta received regular ice shipments, despite sweltering heat. Brazil, where ice became a symbol of elite status. Tudor's genius was not just his vision, it was his logistics. He designed ships with double-layered hulls, packed with sawdust insulation. Ice was loaded below deck in massive blocks, then covered with more sawdust and canvas. Some vessels could carry up to 180 tons of ice at a time. Losses during shipping were expected. 20–40% melt was common, but Tudor calculated carefully. The profit margin was high enough that even partial shipments earned money. In time, competitors entered the trade. Whole fleets of ice schooners came to ply the Atlantic, each voyage a quiet miracle of physics and planning. Moving ice in cities, the ice wagon cometh. In New York, Philadelphia, and Boston, ice didn't just appear in kitchens, it had to be delivered. Enter the ice wagon. Drawn by horses and stacked high with blocks, the wagon rattled through cobblestone streets in early morning hours. Deliverymen, often Irish immigrants or other working-class men, used long tongs and burlap pads to carry blocks into houses, depositing them in the kitchen icebox. The icebox was the predecessor of the refrigerator, a wooden cabinet lined with metal, often with a compartment on top for a 25–50-pound block of ice. Cold air circulated downward. As the ice melted, water drained into a basin that had to be emptied daily. Households kept ice cards in their windows, marked with the number of pounds desired. The iceman, upon seeing a 50 or 25, would chip off the proper amount and haul it inside, often leaving a trail of wet footprints. This system created a whole class of semi-skilled laborers, icemen. Their work was respected and indispensable. In the summer, their arrival meant relief. Cold milk, safe meat, a chilled drink. But it was hard work. Ice was heavy, slippery, and sharp. The men who delivered it rarely lasted past middle age with their health intact. The influence on food and daily life. The ripple effect of the ice trade on daily life was massive. Perishable foods like milk, butter, and meat could be stored longer, improving nutrition and reducing spoilage. Breweries flourished, able to produce lagers year-round using stored ice. Medical use of ice became possible. Fever patients received compresses, and ice was used in rudimentary surgical procedures. Bakeries and confectioners offered chilled pastries, custards, and even ice cream. Before ice, food was dictated by season and preservation. After ice, it was dictated by availability and storage. And this transition was not just physical, it was psychological. Cold became associated with cleanliness, freshness, and modernity. The very idea of spoiled food shifted as expectations changed. All because of a material that, not long before, was simply part of winter's inconvenience. Danger on the docks and decks. While the ice harvesters on frozen lakes faced frostbite and drowning, the men loading ice onto ships or wagons had their own hazards. Crushed fingers and toes were common as blocks shifted during loading. Sawdust inhalation caused respiratory issues, especially in enclosed holds. Slipping on wet decks led to injuries and sometimes death. And yet these jobs were sought after. They paid better than factory work in some cases, especially during peak summer demand. There was dignity in it. You were bringing cold to the people, a relief in July, a luxury in August. The ice houses of the world. As the trade grew, ice houses were built in receiving cities designed to hold imported ice for gradual sale. In Calcutta, Tudor helped construct a massive ice house to support regular shipments. In Havana, similar structures dotted the harbor. But even in places like New Orleans and Savannah, where summer was unrelenting, ice houses became essential municipal infrastructure. Restaurants, markets, and wealthy homes drew their daily ice from these caches, which themselves were filled with the sweat of unseen men from colder lands. In a way, ice became a symbol of connectedness, a frozen thread tying New England to the tropics, one shipment at a time. An industry balanced on seasons. Yet for all its reach, the ice trade was fragile. A warm winter in Massachusetts could shrink the harvest. A shipment delayed by storms might arrive half-melted. Fires at ice houses, often triggered by the heat from compressed sawdust, could destroy entire inventories. Ice was a paradox, abundant but perishable, necessary but unpredictable. And those who worked in the trade understood this. Each winter was a gamble, each voyage a test of insulation, each summer a race against the sun. A world dependent on cold. By the mid-19th century, cities around the world depended on ice, not for luxury, but for basic health and function. The idea of a hot, rotting summer with no ice became unthinkable for many. And yet few people thought about where it came from. The ice was just there cooling the milk, soothing the patient, chilling the lemonade. But back in New England, near the edge of a lake, men were sharpening saws. The ice didn't cut itself. It didn't move itself. It didn't insulate itself. It took hundreds of hands, aching backs and frostbitten fingers to keep the world cold. An icy tension. And now we ask, what happens when the world learns how to make cold without winter? When machines hum and coils chill, when ice no longer needs a lake or a saw? What becomes of the trade, the workers, the tools? And the ice? You followed the ice from lake to wagon, from ice house to ship's hold, from the frigid stillness of New England winters to the sweating port docks of Calcutta and Havana. You've seen how blocks of frozen water sustained food, health, and comfort long before electricity or machinery could provide them. Now, as we reach the end of this story, we watch the sun rise a little earlier and the winter thaw come a little sooner. We hear a different sound, not the rasp of saws on ice, but the low hum of mechanical chillers. Because the trade in natural ice, built on the backs of seasonal laborers and the whims of the weather, was not made to last. And though it once seemed like an unshakable industry, linking ponds in Massachusetts to tea houses in Bombay, it would melt away, as quietly and steadily as its namesake product. The rise of artificial ice. By the late 1800s, inventors had begun developing mechanical refrigeration systems, complex machines that used chemical refrigerants and compressors to artificially produce cold. What began as a novelty quickly matured into an industry. The first artificial ice plants appeared in the 1870s and 1880s, particularly in southern U.S. cities, where winters were too mild to support natural harvesting. These plants could run year-round, unaffected by weather or distance. By 1890, cities like New Orleans, Houston, and even parts of South America had operational ice factories. They no longer had to wait for a schooner from Boston. They could produce ice on demand, whenever needed, however much needed. At first, natural ice still held on. It was seen as cleaner, more natural, and in some cases cheaper. But artificial ice offered something nature never could: predictability. Refrigeration in the home. Even more transformative than ice factories was the development of the electric refrigerator. In the early 20th century, the first domestic refrigerators began to appear clunky, expensive, and only for the wealthy. But by the 1930s, thanks to mass manufacturing, fridges were becoming more accessible. No more waiting for the iceman. No more daily deliveries. No more melting blocks. You simply plugged in a machine, and cold happened. The consequences for the natural ice industry were immediate and irreversible. The last harvest. As demand dwindled, the ice fields of New England fell silent. By the 1920s, many of the great ice houses stood empty. The rail sidings rusted. The ice wagons were sold off. Men who had spent their winters walking the frozen gridlines of ponds and lakes now sought work in cities or factories. A few small operations clung to life in rural areas or as curiosities for tourists. Some New England farms still harvest pond ice today, not for shipping, but for traditional use like cooling maple sap during the sugaring season. But the great export trade, the ships, the ports, the warehouses, is long gone. One by one, the tools disappeared. The long-handled saws, the scoring sleds, the conveyor lifts and ice tongs, sold, scrapped, or rusted into memory. Legacies in stone and dust. If you search the woods near old ponds in Maine or Massachusetts, you might find something. The stone foundation of an ice house, moss-covered and sunken. A few bricks. A ramp now overgrown with weeds. In some places, historic markers commemorate the industry. Towns like Wenham, Fresh Pond, and Kennebunkport recall their ice trade past with plaques and photographs in local museums. You might see a photo of men in wool coats, standing stiffly in front of massive ice blocks, the tools of their trade leaning nearby. The names are rarely recorded. The sawdust once used to insulate the ice. It still lingers in the soil, a layer of fine, acidic sediment that marks where cold was once stored like gold. The changing nature of cold. Today, cold is so common, it's nearly invisible. A hotel lobby, a bottle of milk, the hum behind a grocery store aisle all depend on refrigeration. And that's the irony. In the 19th century, cold was rare, precious, and hard-won. It required entire systems of labor, logistics, timing, and luck. A simple glass of chilled water in July represented the tail end of an immense, invisible supply chain. Now cold is continuous, expected, engineered. And so the memory of the ice harvest fades, not because it was unimportant, but because its success led to its own erasure. The human story of ice. There is something uniquely human about chasing winter, cutting it into blocks, and sending it across oceans. It speaks to our need to control nature, to carry seasons from one hemisphere to another, to hold on to cold when the sun says otherwise. The men who harvested ice did not write books. They left few letters. They were often paid by the block or the day, working long hours in dangerous conditions. But they were part of something extraordinary, a trade that touched lives far beyond their frozen ponds. They brought relief, they brought health, they brought the possibility of preservation. And they did so with saws and sleds. The ice in our imagination. Though the physical industry is gone, echoes of the ice trade remain. In stories of the icebox passed down by grandparents. In the term Iceman, still used occasionally in reference to cool-headed individuals. In old ledgers and freight records, listing tons of ice alongside bolts of cloth and barrels of grain. In the memory of industries, breweries, dairies, meatpacking that relied on this fragile product for survival. Cold, once a burden of winter, became a mark of civilization, and it started with men walking frozen lakes, drawing perfect lines in snow. What we left behind. So what, then, is the legacy of the natural ice trade? It is a reminder that necessity can shape the world in quiet ways, that before machines took over, people solved problems with sweat, patience, and seasonal opportunity. That before plastic coolers and air-conditioned rooms, comfort came in heavy blocks, cut by hand, stored in sawdust, and carried door to door. And that even the most boring trades, if they touch enough lives, become essential history. A final reflection. As the last ice melts in your mind's eye and the horses move away from the lake shore, consider this. In a world where we take cold for granted, do we still understand the cost of keeping things fresh? Story 4. The Tallow Chandlers, lighting the dark before electricity. It is a winter evening in London, somewhere in the 17th century. The air is damp and heavy with coal smoke. The streets are slick with mud and horse dung. The daylight has long since disappeared, swallowed by an early sunset, and now the only light comes from flickering street torches, windows aglow with soft yellow glimmers, and if you step inside, a single candle. Its flame dances slightly in the draft. It doesn't give much light, just enough to write a letter or recognize a face. The wax melts slowly, a greasy puddle forming at its base. The smell is faintly sour, not pleasant but familiar. You are in a world where tallow candles made from animal fat illuminate every home, shop, chapel, and tavern. But who made them? Before electricity, before kerosene, before even widespread oil lamps, candle making was one of the most vital yet overlooked trades in Europe. And among its practitioners were the tallow chandlers, craftsmen of low status, poor materials, and significant importance. This is their story, a story not of light but of what was burned to create it. What is tallow? Tallow is rendered animal fat, typically from sheep or cows and sometimes pigs. In appearance, it's white or off-white, solid at room temperature and faintly sticky when warm. It was a byproduct salvaged from butchers, slaughterhouses, and kitchen scraps. To make tallow suitable for candles, it had to be purified or clarified. This meant boiling it slowly, skimming off impurities, straining it through cloth or fine sieves, and letting it solidify. The smell was never quite gone. Even in its clean form, tallow gave off a sour, meaty scent when burned. But for centuries, tallow was the light of the poor and the working class. Beeswax, with its pleasant smell and slow, clean burn, was reserved for churches, royal courts, and the wealthy. It was expensive, rare, and heavily taxed. If you were an ordinary person living in a cramped tenement or a small country cottage, you lit your evenings with tallow. The process of chandling. The word chandler comes from the Old French chandelier, originally meaning candle seller or maker. Tallow chandlers made candles by hand dipping or mold casting. Hand dipping. This was the most common and accessible method. A row of cotton or linen wicks was suspended from a wooden rod. The wicks were dipped into a vat of melted tallow. Each wick was pulled up, allowed to cool briefly, then dipped again. This process repeated 30 to 40 times, gradually building up layers until a candle of the desired thickness formed. Dipping was slow and delicate. The tallow had to remain at the right temperature. Too cold and it clumped, too hot and it ran off. Chandlers often made hundreds of candles per day, working over open vats in poorly ventilated workshops. The smell was overwhelming. The floors were slick. The tools were greasy. It was hot, repetitive work, and dangerous. Tallow caught fire easily. Mold casting. By the 18th century, candle molds made from tin or brass allowed for more uniform candles. Liquid tallow was poured into these molds with wicks already threaded through. After cooling and solidifying, the candles were removed, trimmed, and packaged. This method was cleaner and more efficient, but the early molds were expensive, and only wealthier chandlers could afford them. The tallow chandler's workshop. A typical chandler's workshop was cramped, dark, and odorous. Walls were lined with drying racks, and the air shimmered with grease vapor. Buckets of raw tallow stood in corners, waiting to be rendered. Rats were a constant nuisance. Work began before dawn and ended after sunset. Candles had to be dried, trimmed, wrapped, and sold in bundles usually of 12, known as a long dozen. The candles were tied with twine and packed into rough paper or straw. In colder weather, the tallow solidified too fast. In summer, it melted too easily. There was no good season for tallow chandlers, only constant adaptation. Because everyone needed candles, and very few wanted to make them. Tallow and society, light for the lower classes. Tallow candles were everywhere in early modern life. One estimate suggests that a family of 5 might burn 1 or 2 candles a night, more if they could afford it, fewer if they were poor. They were used for reading and writing by those literate enough to do so, meal preparation and eating after sunset, walking at night with hand lanterns or candle stubs, keeping time. Some candles were marked with hour lines. Religious rituals, especially in Protestant homes, where beeswax was sometimes frowned upon as popish. But they were imperfect. They burned quickly, often just 4-6 hours per candle. They smoked heavily, leaving soot on walls and ceilings. They dripped constantly, requiring candle holders and trays to catch the mess. The smell was persistent, described as a mix of rancid meat and burnt hair. Still, for most people, tallow was the only option. It was sold by local chandlers, at general stores, or by traveling peddlers. Even rural households often made their own. The affordability of tallow defined the rhythm of evening life. When candles ran out, the night ended. Chandlers' guilds and regulation. In cities like London, the Tallow Chandlers' Company was a recognized guild founded in 1462 with the power to regulate who could sell and manufacture candles. The guild set standards for candle size and weight, purity of tallow, selling practices and prices. Apprenticeships lasted 7 years, after which a journeyman could open his own shop if he had the money. But enforcement was inconsistent. In poorer districts, illegal or subpar candles were common. Some were adulterated with lard, fish oil, or bone grease, burning poorly and stinking even worse. Nevertheless, guilds offered some protection. In times of war or shortage, they lobbied for tallow access. They managed local disputes, and they formed part of the city's intricate web of trade regulation. Tallow chandlers were not powerful, but they were essential. A world in flame. Before electricity, night was not dark in the way we imagine. It was orange, flickering, shadowy. Tallow light was dim and uneven, casting distorted shapes on walls. It didn't fill a room. It illuminated only what was close: faces, plates, books, tools. And it was precious. Some households rationed candles carefully. One for the sitting room, none for the children's beds. Only on special occasions could an extra be lit. Children were scolded for reading too long by candlelight, less for their eyesight, and more for the cost. The average household in 1700s England spent as much on lighting as they did on bread. This was the world tallow chandlers supplied. Not a world of abundance, but one of controlled glow, a balance between necessity and expense, utility and unpleasantness. The unspoken burden. It's easy to forget how central candles once were to civilization. They marked the hours, lit the births and deaths, carried prayers, protected travelers, enabled thought, prolonged labor. And they were made, not by machines, but by hands steeped in fat and fire. The tallow chandler was not celebrated. His shop stank. His trade was grimy, but without him the world would have ended at sundown. A glimmering question. So here we are in the candle-lit twilight of an ordinary 17th century evening. The street glows faintly. The room is quiet but alive with flickering shadows. A single tallow candle burns lower, its wick curling, its base a pool of spent grease. And we ask, how much of history happened by the light of something nobody wanted to touch? In the last section, you met the tallow chandler, a figure cloaked in the stink of grease and the necessity of light. Their days were spent boiling animal fat, dipping wicks, and packaging bundles of cheap, smoky candles, each one destined to burn for a few dim hours in kitchens, taverns, tenements, and alleyways. But the story of the tallow chandler does not end in the workshop. It stretches outward into the dark, narrow streets of growing cities, into the rooms of poets and laborers alike, into marketplaces where the line between food, fuel, and filth blurred. To understand the world of tallow is to follow its greasy fingerprints wherever they were smudged, not just on candlesticks, but on ceilings, coin purses, and social hierarchies. Let's walk deeper into the glow and the grime. The supply chain of fat. Tallow chandlers relied entirely on one material, fat, and not just any fat. The best tallow came from mature cattle or sheep, their fat carefully rendered after slaughter. Where did all that fat come from? From the slaughterhouses, butchers, and meat markets of the city. In places like London's Smithfield Market or Paris's La Villette, animals were brought in daily, slaughtered in back alleys, gutted, skinned, and sectioned into meat for sale. The rest, bones, organs, hooves, fat, was sold separately. Tallow chandlers often worked closely with knackers and offal dealers, buying up buckets of suet and scrap fat before it spoiled. The quality varied wildly. Prime tallow came from well-fed oxen or mutton. Low-grade tallow, rancid or mixed with water, burned poorly, smelled worse, and fetched a lower price. Chandlers sometimes rendered the fat themselves, boiling it over fires in iron cauldrons and straining it through cloth. Others bought pre-rendered tallow in barrels, often with salt added as a preservative. The result, a trade network of fat. From countryside farms to city gutters, animal grease flowed into chandlers' shops like wax into a mold. And when supply was scarce during wartime, famine, or disease, prices soared. Without fat, there was no light. The candle tax and the cost of illumination. In England during the 18th century, candles were taxed, not lightly either. Beginning in 1709, Parliament levied a duty on all candles sold. Candle makers had to register, pay a licensing fee, and charge tax per pound of product. These taxes were intended to raise funds for the crown, but in practice, they hit poor households hardest. To avoid paying, some people made candles illegally at home, using kitchen scraps or stolen tallow. Bought smuggled candles from illicit sellers. Switched to rushlight strips of dried plant stalks dipped in animal fat, far cheaper but dangerously flammable and short-lived. The candle tax created a thriving underground economy. Night chandlers would operate quietly, selling candles after hours without a license. Penalties were steep fines or even prison, but the demand was constant. Eventually, the tax was repealed in 1831, after more than a century of popular resentment. Until then, a flickering tallow flame also illuminated the politics of inequality. Candles and class, who got to see after dark. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the amount of light in your home was a visible marker of status. The nobility and upper classes could afford multiple beeswax candles, chandeliers, mirrored sconces, and candelabras. Their rooms glowed gold and smoke-free. The middle class might afford a few candles each night, tallow, maybe wax on Sundays, one per room, carefully monitored. The working poor had one candle, maybe two, used sparingly. A child might be sent to borrow a neighbor's stub when theirs burned out. In some rural areas, families went to bed when the sun set and rose with the dawn, not from superstition, but economics. Each extra hour of light came at a price. Even in urban boarding houses, shared candles were common. A single flame placed in the hallway might be all the light several families shared for nighttime needs. So when we read about burning the midnight oil or reading by candlelight, we must remember, someone paid dearly for that flame, whether in money, labor, or lost sleep. Tallow and the public sphere. Beyond homes, tallow candles lit the working world. Taverns and inns used dozens per night. The low quality didn't matter, drunks weren't picky. Workshops and garrets burned candles into the early hours, especially among weavers, cobblers, and other tradesmen. Churches, when unable to afford wax, resorted to tallow for common services. Prisons and poorhouses gave inmates the bare minimum of candlelight, sometimes only on Sundays. Meanwhile, city officials struggled to light public spaces. Street lighting, where it existed, was rudimentary at best. In London, some wealthier parishes began installing oil lamps in the 18th century, but most neighborhoods relied on private lanterns or window candles to keep foot traffic safe. Tallow candles placed in horn lanterns were used by watchmen, milkmaids, night soil collectors, and surgeons alike. But their flaws were obvious. They smoked, went out in wind, and dripped constantly. Still, until gas lighting arrived in the early 1800s, there was no better option for those who couldn't afford better. Candle waste and soot, the hidden costs. Tallow wasn't clean. Every candle burned left residue. Black soot accumulated on ceilings, walls, and curtains. Grease stains marked candle holders, hands, and tabletops. Clogged chimneys posed fire hazards in homes, burning dozens of candles each night. Drippings were collected and remelted, a practice so common that special grease cups existed in some homes. In wealthier households, chambermaids were responsible for cleaning and maintaining candles, trimming wicks, scraping holders, and collecting leftovers for remolding. In poorer homes, nothing was wasted. The end of one candle became the beginning of the next. Scrapings were saved in pots, melted down again, and redipped. It was an endless cycle: use, reuse, scavenge, repeat. The end of the tallow era. By the mid-19th century, the world began to shift. Gas lighting arrived in cities, first in street lamps, then in theaters and homes. Paraffin wax, distilled from coal or petroleum, offered a cleaner burning alternative to tallow. Stearic acid candles made from refined animal fat were harder and less smoky. Tallow chandlers, once everywhere, began to disappear. Some adapted, switching to new materials or specializing in decorative candles. Others closed their shops. In time, only a few remained, catering to ritual use, like in churches or rural markets. By the 20th century, tallow chandling was virtually extinct. But the smell, the smoke, and the glow linger in stories and records, and in soot-stained ceilings that still bear witness to a time when every hour after sunset was paid for in grease. A question in the dark. We live now in a world flooded with light, instant, clean, invisible in effort. But once not so long ago, every moment of brightness came with a smell, a texture, a laborer behind it, a room that slowly darkened when the candle flickered out. So we ask, what happens to memory when we no longer need to touch what gives us light? In the flickering shadows of narrow workshops and cramped parlors, the light from tallow candles once defined the rhythm of the night. The hands that made them were coated in grease. The air that received them was thick with soot. The lives lit by them were, in every sense, defined by fire. Now, as we trace the final arc of this story, we turn our attention to the decline, the slow extinguishing of a craft that had for centuries been essential, mundane, and largely invisible. The tallow chandler's fire, like the candles they made, burned brightly for a time. But as science advanced, and the world learned to tame flame with machinery, the ancient flicker gave way to something colder, cleaner, and quieter. This is the story of the last candles, and the long shadow of forgotten light. The arrival of gaslight. The beginning of the end came with a hiss, not a spark. In the early 19th century, gas lighting arrived in Europe's cities. First demonstrated in factories and theaters, gas offered something candles could not: steady, bright, controllable illumination. A single gas jet produced more light than several tallow candles. Gas could be piped into buildings, avoiding the mess of wax and drippings. It burned cleaner, with less smoke and odor. In London, gaslit street lamps began appearing in 1812, followed by homes, businesses, and public buildings. Paris followed. So did Berlin. Over the next few decades, gaslight became a symbol of progress, of modernity chasing away the darkness. For the tallow chandler, it was an existential threat. Though candles remained in use in rural areas and among the poor, demand in cities declined sharply. Chandlers who had once sold thousands of candles a week now struggled to find steady customers. The industry, never glamorous, became increasingly archaic. Paraffin and steric wax, cleaner flames, fewer chandlers. While gas lit the cities, another change reshaped the candle itself. In the 1830s and 1840s, chemists developed methods to extract steric acid from animal fats and paraffin wax from petroleum. These materials burned longer, cleaner, and with far less odor than tallow. Paraffin in particular became popular because it was easy to mold, white and unscented, inexpensive when refined. These new waxes transformed the candle from a necessity into a choice. People now used candles when they wanted to, not because they had to. Tallow, with its unpleasant smell and messy burn, was left behind. Chandlers who adapted survived, becoming manufacturers of decorative, scented, or ceremonial candles. Others faded, closed, or turned to other trades. By the end of the 19th century, few tallow chandlers remained. Candles become ceremony. With electricity's arrival in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the candle lost its status as an essential household tool. No longer needed for cooking or food prep, reading or writing at night, street navigation, nighttime labor. Candles shifted into symbolism. They became romantic, used in dinners, weddings, and intimate spaces. Religious, still burned in churches, synagogues, and temples across the world. Ceremonial, lighting cakes on birthdays, marking vigils, or commemorating the dead. Decorative, designed with color, scent, and shape to please rather than to serve. And in that transformation, tallow disappeared almost entirely. Modern candles are made from soy wax, beeswax, paraffin, or blends. Most consumers today have never seen, smelled, or touched tallow. And they likely never will. Preserving the memory, museums, guilds, and ghosts. Only a few fragments remain of the tallow chandler's world. The worshipful company of tallow chandlers still exists in London, though today it functions as a charitable and ceremonial organization. It maintains a guild hall, but no longer makes candles. A handful of living history museums demonstrate traditional candle making, using tallow to show the texture, the smell, the technique. Historical reenactors sometimes recreate tallow chandling, dipping wicks in boiling fat as visitors watch with both fascination and revulsion. In literature and folk memory, the chandler has almost vanished. No fairy tales feature a heroic candle maker. No poems mourn the last shop to smell of rendered sheep fat. But their legacy is everywhere light once was. Every time we flip a switch, we bypass centuries of labor. Every time a candle flickers in a church or a lantern glows on a porch, it echoes a world where such light was costly, smoky, and steeped in grease. The soot left behind. And what of the impact? What did tallow leave behind? Soot-darkened ceilings still survive in some historic homes, layered in the residue of thousands of candles. Candle molds and tools, now collector's items or museum pieces, speak to the everyday skills of once indispensable workers. Old housekeeping manuals preserve the tips, trim the wick, catch the drips, save the ends. In some rare places, archaeological digs uncover buried remnants, fat-stained floorboards, candle nubs, grease jars. But perhaps the greatest residue is invisibility. The chandler's contribution was never glamorous. Their names rarely appeared in books or records. They were tradespeople of the most ordinary kind. And yet they lit the world, one dip at a time. A world without darkness. Today, most people fear power outages, not because they will be plunged into chaos, but because they'll be inconvenienced. In the past, darkness was the default. Light was labor. Tallow was the bridge between sunset and morning. Imagine for a moment trying to learn your letters, or sew a garment, or tend to a sick child by the flicker of a single greasy flame. That was the ordinary night for most of human history. And it was brought to you by someone who stirred a pot of fat, dipped a wick, and did it again. Final reflection. The story of the tallow chandler is not luminous. It is oily, smoky, and nearly forgotten. But it is a story of survival, of providing light, however imperfect, to a world that could not afford to be without it. And so we end with this question. What other trades, long extinguished, once carried the weight of every human hour after dusk? Story 5. How Viking women managed longhouses in the absence of warriors. In the popular image of the Viking Age, roughly 800 to 1100 CE, we often see the man, bearded, armored, oars in hand or sword raised, eyes fixed on some distant raid or trading venture. Longships cleave the waves, helmets gleam, settlements burn. But that's only part of the story. For every warrior who left Scandinavia on a ship bound for Britain, Francia, or the Rus lands, someone stayed behind. A home remained. A farm needed tending. Children needed raising. Fires needed feeding through long winters. Those who remained, especially in the cold, narrow valleys and windswept coasts of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, were often women. And in their hands, a different kind of survival took shape. One not carved with axe or sharpened on iron, but built around the longhouse, the animals, the fields, and the rhythms of daily life. This is the story of Viking women not as queens or shield maidens, but as managers, survivors, and masters of the domestic domain. In the absence of warriors, they held the world together with quiet strength and everyday skill. The longhouse, a world under one roof. To understand Viking women's roles, we must begin with their world, the longhouse or langhus. This was the central structure of rural Norse life, a long, narrow building made of timber, turf, and stone. Most longhouses were 40 to 75 feet long, though some exceeded 100 feet. They had thick, sloping walls insulated with turf or stacked stone. A central hearth that burned constantly for heat and cooking. Low, dark interiors, smoky and dim, with few or no windows. Partitioned sections for animals, sleeping, storage, and work. A single longhouse might house 10 to 20 people, a mix of family, farmhands, and perhaps even tenants or servants. In winter, livestock were kept indoors, in stalls at one end of the house, adding both warmth and smell. The longhouse was more than shelter. It was a center of labor, a social unit, and a micro-kingdom. And in the absence of the male head of household, it was run by women. The husfrige, lady of the house. The woman who managed the longhouse was called the husfrige, literally, housewife, but not in the modern sense. This was a formal, powerful role recognized by law and custom. The husfrige was in charge of food storage and preparation. She oversaw drying, smoking, salting, and fermenting food for the winter months. Weaving and textile production. She managed the loom, made clothing, and organized other women's work. Household labor. She assigned tasks to family members and servants, supervised maintenance, and ensured everything ran smoothly. Religious practice. In many households, she also maintained domestic rituals, honored household spirits, landvitir, and kept seasonal traditions alive. When her husband left on a voyage which might last months or even years, she became de facto head of the household. This was not an informal arrangement. Norse sagas, laws, and archaeology confirm that women had considerable authority, especially in their husband's absence. Running the farm. Most Viking households depended on small-scale subsistence farming. Grain, hay, livestock, and dairy were essential to survival. Crops had to be sown and harvested. Hay had to be cut and stored before winter. Sheep had to be sheared, cows milked, and pigs slaughtered. When men left for trade or raiding, this work did not stop. In fact, it became more urgent. A failed harvest or poor fodder season could mean starvation. Women directed this labor, often with the help of older sons, servants, or thralls, enslaved people. They maintained plows, tools, and fences, planned crop rotations and pasture use, handled animal births, wool collection, and butter making. In some cases, especially in Iceland or remote Norwegian valleys, women managed multiple farmsteads or took over legal authority during their husband's absence. This was not exceptional, it was expected. The loom and the wealth of women. One of the central tools of a Viking woman's work was the warp-weighted loom, a vertical frame used to weave fabric from wool or flax. Weaving was more than domestic necessity. It was economically vital. Sails for longships required massive amounts of wool and months of labor. Cloth was a form of currency in parts of Scandinavia and Iceland. Clothing, bedding, and trade goods all depended on textile production. The husfrige oversaw a team of women in the production of fabric, from carding and spinning wool to dyeing, weaving, and sewing. In some sagas, a woman's skill at weaving is mentioned alongside her beauty or intelligence. It was a mark of status and capability. And it wasn't just textiles. Viking women also brewed ale, processed dairy, and managed trade goods, including items brought back by their husbands. Legal rights and land ownership. Unlike many other European societies of the time, Viking women enjoyed notable legal rights. They could own and inherit land, initiate divorce, serve as witnesses in legal disputes, manage estates during a husband's absence or death. Widows, in particular, were powerful figures. Many controlled large estates and made decisions typically associated with male heads of household. Archaeological finds such as grave goods, keys, and scale weights suggest that some women were not only household managers, but active in trade and market life. One grave in Oseberg, Norway, contained a woman buried with a richly furnished wagon, tools, and textiles, indicating immense wealth and influence. Was she a noblewoman, a religious leader, a merchant? We do not know, but she was clearly a person of authority. Loneliness, strength, and waiting. Of course, managing a longhouse wasn't just labor, it was loneliness too. Men often sailed for years. Some never returned. Others came home with injuries, with tales of distant lands, or with foreign children. The Husfrige had to hold the household together, raise the children, bury the dead, and plan for a future she couldn't predict. Some women remarried. Others became matriarchs, holding land and family together through successive generations. Their resilience is not dramatized in tales of conquest, but it is woven into the very fabric of Norse society. A quiet foundation. The longship may have carried the Viking world outward, but the longhouse kept it alive. Every nail driven into a hull, every garment worn in distant lands, every bowl of stew served on a snowy night was made possible by women who managed fire, food, cloth, and land. And so we ask, when warriors chase glory abroad, who ensures there's a world to return to? In the last section, we explored the powerful role of the Husfrige, the lady of the longhouse who, while her husband sailed distant coasts, became the steward of daily life in Viking society. Her hands tended livestock, wove sails, brewed ale, and fed the hearth. But this role extended beyond house and field. In the social world of the Norse, where raiding and trading were risky, often fatal and deeply seasonal, the person left behind had to do more than keep the fire lit. She had to represent, defend, and preserve the household's place in society. Because in Viking society, a household was a legal entity, and when the warrior left, the woman became its voice. The woman in the law thing. Norse culture was governed by a combination of customary law and public assembly, known as the thing, a place where disputes were settled, contracts were made, and justice was served. Women could not speak at all things, especially in larger assemblies, but in local affairs and property-related disputes, they often played a more direct role than their continental European counterparts. A Husfrige had to defend her property against encroachment or theft, represent her absent husband's interest in tenancy disputes, testify as a witness in inheritance claims, especially in Iceland, manage legal payments, known as wergild, in cases of injury, death, or honor disputes involving family members. In practice, this meant negotiation, knowledge of customary law, and shrewd social positioning. A woman who could not maintain her household's legal standing could see her land claimed, her alliances broken, or her children disinherited. And in an oral culture where law lived in memory, this knowledge was taught, not written, often passed from mother to daughter. Widows, elders, and the power of aid. If the Husfrige held the house, the widow often held the village. Older women in Viking society could command enormous respect, particularly if they had successfully raised sons, managed land, or amassed wealth. They were keepers of memory, remembering genealogies and blood ties that shaped alliances. Guardians of local custom, advising younger women in legal and ritual matters. Sources of economic stability, especially those who inherited from deceased husbands or sons. Some widows never remarried. Their households became centers of multi-generational life, where younger family members depended on them for guidance, authority, and material support. The staff woman, sometimes mentioned in sagas, was an elder who wielded a ceremonial staff, perhaps linked to both household authority and ritual roles. Her presence suggests that age and wisdom held distinct power, especially in the absence of men. Trade and women's work beyond the hearth. While the longhouse was the core of domestic life, it wasn't a prison. Viking women, especially those in urban settlements like Birka, Hedeby, and York, Jorvik, were actively involved in trade and market activity. Archaeological finds show weights and scales buried in female graves, tools of commerce. Imported goods like silk, beads, and amber associated with women's workshops. Keys often found with women, symbolizing not just the home but economic control. In ports and trading towns, women likely sold cloth, dairy, or crafts at local markets. Managed family businesses, especially when their husbands were abroad. Handled credit and barter, keeping household accounts in goods rather than coins. While much of this activity remains inferred from objects and burial goods, it paints a picture of women who did not wait idly for their husbands to return. They engaged with the world just differently than those who left in ships. Saga literature, women as negotiators and catalysts. The Norse sagas, written down in the 13th century but based on older oral traditions, offer a window into the cultural memory of Viking life. Women in these stories are not passive figures. They advise kings and chieftains, arrange marriages and alliances, avenge wrongs or demand justice, protect family honor, sometimes more fiercely than the men. Consider Gudrun Osvifsdottir from Laxdæla Saga, who marries 4 times, outlives each husband, and becomes one of the most psychologically complex figures in saga literature. She is not a raider or queen, but she steers her family's fate with cunning, loyalty, and strength. Or Un the Deep-Minded, a historical figure celebrated in Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements, who sailed to Iceland with her household after her son's death and became a landowner, shipowner, and matriarch. These are not fantasy heroines. They reflect the roles Viking women could and often did play in a society built around family alliances, land, and reputation. Religious roles and the sacred domestic. Before Christianity spread across Scandinavia in the 10th and 11th centuries, Norse religion was a system of household practices, seasonal rites, and ancestor veneration, and many of these rituals were the domain of women. In this spiritual world, women tended household altars and hearthfires sacred to deities like Frigg, Freya, and Thor, conducted blot sacrifices, especially in domestic settings, served as Valvas seeresses, women who entered trances, interpreted omens, and guided the future. The Valva was a distinct, semi-religious role. Though rare, she appears in sagas and graves adorned with staffs, herbs, and ritual tools. She was respected and sometimes feared as someone who bridged the everyday and the otherworldly. Even ordinary women participated in seasonal customs, blessing the land, ensuring good harvests, and preserving family ties through ritual. The sacred and the domestic were not separate. They were woven together like warp and weft. Children and lineage, continuity in a dangerous world. In a society defined by both mobility and mortality, Viking women played the essential role of lineage bearers. They named and raised children, taught oral traditions and genealogies, organized fostering arrangements, a common Norse practice to strengthen alliances. Children were seen as vital economically and politically. Boys might be trained for raiding or farming. Girls learned weaving, household management, and law from mothers and grandmothers. And when fathers didn't return from sea, the matrilineal knowledge carried the family forward. In this way, Viking women weren't just maintaining life, they were preparing the next generation to rebuild, adapt, and remember. An invisible empire. The Viking Age is remembered for ships, swords, and sagas, but behind it stood an empire of unrecorded labor, a civilization carried on the backs of those who milked cows, spun wool, salted fish, raised children, and held legal ground. Women did not need to swing swords to wield power. They wielded continuity. Their empires weren't drawn on maps. They were measured in land inherited, lineages preserved, and longhouses kept standing through snow, hunger, and waiting. A lingering question. So when we picture a Viking longhouse at dusk, firelight flickering on beams, children whispering, animals shifting in the straw, we should ask, is the world built only by those who leave, or also by those who choose to stay? We've stepped inside the longhouse, followed the Husfrija through seasons of planting, weaving, birthing, and mourning. We've stood at the loom, sat before the hearth, and walked the muddy paths to the Thingstead, where laws and futures were spoken aloud. Now, in the final section of this story, we leave the day-to-day and look at the legacy, what it meant, and still means, to manage a society not by conquest or command, but through endurance, maintenance, and memory. Because the Viking Age, like all ages, eventually ended, but the world shaped by Viking women, the one built around longhouses, kin networks, oral laws, and everyday survival, did not simply vanish. It transformed, quietly, like winter giving way to spring. And its influence lingers in places where few think to look. From pagan matrons to Christian mothers. By the end of the Viking Age, around 1100 CE, Christianity had spread across Scandinavia. With it came changes in law, gender expectations, and household structure. Christian doctrine promoted male-dominated family hierarchies, increased control over marriage and inheritance by church and state, greater restrictions on women's public roles. The Husfrija's power shifted. While she still managed the home, her legal autonomy was gradually curtailed. The Volva, once a mystical figure of seership and ritual, became a heretic or witch under the new faith. Some were condemned, others were forgotten. And yet much remained. The longhouse did not vanish overnight, nor did the systems of rural labor, oral knowledge, or matrilineal transmission of custom. Viking women, now called bondwives, farm wives, or simply mothers, still tilled land, raised livestock, and taught children through winters that hadn't changed. In the domestic sphere, the Husfrija's spirit lived on, shaped by survival more than ideology. Echoes in the sagas and soil. Even after the Viking Age ended, stories of strong, capable women persisted in the sagas, some written centuries later. They were not always idealized. Some were cunning, vengeful, or harsh, but they were central. These stories reflect not a fantasy, but a memory, a cultural truth. And archaeology supports it. Keys, a symbol of household authority, are consistently found in female graves from the Viking Age. Burial goods show women associated with both domestic and trade items, weaving weights, scales, beads, imported goods. Settlement patterns suggest that farms and homes continued through female inheritance in many regions. Even the naming traditions, where family names pass through both mother and father, hint at a balanced sense of lineage, unusual in the broader medieval world. The domestic as strategic. What we learn from these women is not simply that they worked hard, though they certainly did. It's that their work was strategic. Weaving wasn't just clothing, it was sail-making, wealth creation, and international trade. Managing the farm wasn't just subsistence, it was holding land for future generations and maintaining legal presence. Raising children wasn't just maternal, it was political. It preserved the line, the name, and the alliance. Keeping the hearth wasn't sentimental, it was survival. In a world where warriors might never return, Viking women planned for possibility and prepared for loss. And they kept going. The psychological landscape, waiting and withstanding. We sometimes forget the emotional dimension of this history. Imagine watching the ships leave the fjord, unsure which would return, bearing the weight of rumor heard from travelers, traders, or wounded men, managing drought, illness, or poor harvests alone, shielding children from grief while preparing them for the same path. This emotional labor, often invisible in records, is a form of resilience just as profound as wielding a sword. The longhouse was not just wood and turf. It was a place of waiting, of learning to continue with uncertainty as a constant guest. And that too was power. The decline of a role, not of its value. By the 12th century, many of the social structures that had empowered Norse women began to fade under Christianized law and feudal systems. Women's legal rights to inheritance and land ownership were often reduced or reinterpreted. Monasteries and noble estates absorbed what had once been family farms. But the knowledge remained. In isolated valleys, coastal communities, and northern settlements, the practices of self-sufficiency, household governance, and textile mastery continued well into the modern era. Even today, in some rural parts of Norway and Iceland, traditions of maternal land inheritance persist, echoes of a time when a woman didn't just manage the household. She was the household. Cultural memory, what we remember, what we do. Why are Viking women less visible in popular history? Perhaps because their power was not loud, not forged in war or won in council, but held in repetition, 1,000 daily decisions, a constant series of judgments, risks, and quiet victories. And yet their absence in the spotlight is misleading. Without them, there would be no fields to return to, no wealth stored for winter, no children raised to carry names, no cloth for sails, no food for the hearth, no sagas to tell. Their history may be boring, in the sense that it is repetitive, ordinary, and domestic, but it is the kind of boring that builds civilizations. The longhouse today, what remains? Some reconstructed longhouses now stand as open-air museums. Tourists walk through their smoky interiors, touch the wool blankets, and listen to docents describe life back then. But something is lost in translation. The longhouse was not just a building. It was a system of endurance, a machine for surviving winter, for managing absence, for raising new generations in a world of violence and change. And women made that system work. Even as men sailed away, chasing silver and glory, the true wealth of Viking society stayed home, alive in the minds, hands, and hearts of those who did not leave. Final reflection. So as we close this longhouse door, hear again the steady rhythm of a loom, the sound of milk pails being filled, the soft breathing of sleeping children, and the crackling of the hearth. These were the sounds of survival. And ask yourself, in the stories we tell of adventure and conquest, how often do we pause to honor the ones who stayed behind and made it possible? Story 6. Salt Roads of the Sahara, the silent economy of white gold. The desert is quiet. Not silent, the wind always speaks, but quiet in a way that presses inward. Sound is swallowed by space. The horizon stretches flat and golden, and somewhere out there on the great sand sea of the Sahara, a line of camels walks in single file, their hooves making no noise, their backs laden with long, gray slabs of stone. But they're not stones. They're salt bars carved from ancient earth, stacked like bricks and wrapped in leather. Each weighs more than a man can carry. Each one, centuries ago, was worth its weight in gold. This is the beginning of a story rarely told loudly. It's not a tale of kings or battles, but of caravans, camels, and salt, a substance so essential to life that entire civilizations once rose and fell along the dusty roads that moved it. Welcome to the salt roads of the Sahara, a vast network of trade routes that stretched from the oases of North Africa to the Sahelian kingdoms of Mali, Songhai, and Ghana. And at the heart of it all, white gold. Why salt? Today, salt is so common we barely think about it. A few cents a pound, available in every kitchen. But for most of human history, salt was precious not just for flavor but for preservation. In the hot, dry regions of West Africa, salt was a necessity. It replaced electrolytes lost through sweat. It preserved food, especially fish and meat, in areas without refrigeration. It was used in rituals, medicine, and animal husbandry. and in some cultures, it was seen as sacred, a purifier, a protector. The southern peoples, especially in the Sahel and Savannah, had gold but little natural salt. The desert peoples, especially near ancient dried-up seabeds like Taghaza and Talyudeni, had salt, but lacked metals, cloth, and food. So a trade began. Not a market stall exchange, but a 1,000-mile journey across one of the harshest environments on Earth. The caravan, ships of the desert. The backbone of the salt trade was the camel, specifically the dromedary or one-humped camel, introduced to North Africa around the 3rd century CE. Camels revolutionized trans-Saharan trade. They could go 10 days without water. They could carry 300–400 pounds of cargo. Their wide, padded feet made them ideal for sand travel. A typical salt caravan consisted of hundreds, sometimes thousands of camels, organized by merchants and guided by Berber or Tuareg nomads who knew the land, the stars, and the water holes. Each camel carried several slabs of salt, often accompanied by cloth, metal goods, or small food stores. The journey from the salt mines to markets like Timbuktu, Gao, or Walata could take weeks or even months, depending on the route. The caravan moved with deliberate slowness. March at dawn, rest at midday, march again at dusk. Avoid sandstorms, navigate dunes, listen for signs of raiders. Stop at wells and oases, many of them controlled by local tribes who charged tolls or required tribute. The journey was dangerous, but potentially profitable. Each slab of salt could be traded for gold dust, grain, livestock, or cloth. For many, the salt road was a way of life. Men inherited roots from fathers. Caravans became communities, and the desert, for all its silence, became a place of commerce and connection. The salt mines, Taghaza and Talyudeni. In the heart of the Sahara, where sand meets sun, and nothing seems alive, lie the salt mines of Taghaza and Talyudeni. Taghaza, located in what is now northern Mali, Taghaza was active from at least the 13th century. The salt here formed thick underground layers, the remains of an ancient sea. Workers dug shallow pits and carved the salt into rectangular blocks. Conditions were brutal. There was no food or water in the region. It all had to be imported. The sun scorched, the dust choked, the salt cut fingers and burned wounds. Most miners were slaves, often captured from southern raids or purchased through trade. Taghaza wasn't a town, it was a salt camp, a place to dig, suffer, and ship the slabs onward. Yet its importance was vast. In the 14th century, Moroccan historian Ibn Battuta visited and noted that even the houses were made of salt, sealed with camel skins. Talyudeni. Further north in modern Mauritania, the Talyudeni mines rose to prominence in later centuries. Still operational today, Talyudeni is one of the last places where salt is extracted by hand, loaded onto camels, and marched south. Even now, the method is almost unchanged. Men dig pits, cut salt into bars, and prepare for the long journey. The heat is intense, the work backbreaking, the pay low. But the tradition endures. Salt and gold, a trade of equals. It's tempting to think of salt as the lesser trade good, exchanged upward for shiny gold. But in many cases, salt and gold were of equal value. In fact, in some parts of West Africa, salt was used as currency, with slabs or even shavings traded for goods. A single salt slab could buy a slave, a horse, or several days' food. In the markets of Timbuktu, salt was weighed and measured like coins. The famous Ghana Empire, which flourished from the 6th to 13th centuries, taxed salt heavily as it moved through its territory, building much of its wealth from controlling this trade. Later, the Mali Empire, under rulers like Mansa Musa, developed complex trade networks, with salt caravans forming a core economic artery. And in every instance, the system depended not just on goods, but on trust, knowledge, and endurance. The Sahara could not be crossed by force alone. It demanded cooperation between tribes, merchants, and guides. The quiet work of movement. This was not an empire of castles or crowns. It was an empire of movement, a geography of trust, roots, and oaths. The salt roads were not paved. They were memorized, passed down through oral tradition, mapped in the stars, marked by distant hills or a solitary tree. A caravan master might remember where to dig for emergency water, when to cross a dune field safely, which tribes to pay tribute to and which to avoid, which slab of salt came from which mine, and how that affected its value. And all this moved not with speed, but with persistence, a rhythm measured in steps, in breath, in the shifting sand beneath the hooves of camels. A world built on what was carried. We remember empires for what they built. The Salt Road tells us of an empire built on what was carried. And so, as the caravan disappears into the heat shimmer of the horizon, the question emerges. How many civilizations were built not by those who conquered, but by those who simply kept walking? In Section 1, we followed the silent caravan, a chain of camels and men moving slowly across the vast, sun-scoured expanse of the Sahara. Their burden was not treasure, but salt, gray-white slabs chipped from desert mines and hauled across thousands of miles of heat and emptiness. But that silence ended when the caravan arrived. Because beyond the dunes and the dust lay the southern empires Ghana, Mali, Songhai civilizations built not on conquest alone, but on commerce. They did not conquer salt, they taxed it, they stored it, they traded it like coin. And as salt flowed south and gold flowed north, the desert did not divide these worlds, it connected them. Now, let us explore what happened at the southern end of the Salt Road, where merchants met monarchs, and slabs of mineral crystal transformed into power. Timbuktu, where salt met gold. At the edge of the Sahara, where desert fades into Sahel grassland, stood Timbuktu, perhaps the most famous city on the medieval trade route. In the 14th and 15th centuries, Timbuktu was a caravan terminus, where salt arrived in great stacks and was exchanged for goods. A gold marketplace, drawing merchants from across West Africa and beyond. A scholarly center, home to Islamic schools, libraries, and judges. When salt arrived from Taoudeni or Tagheza, it was unloaded in massive piles, often stacked neatly along the outskirts of town. Each slab was marked with identifying notches indicating the mine, the caravan, or the merchant. In return, caravans could receive gold dust, measured in hollowed gourds or wrapped in cloth, ivory, slaves, cola nuts, or millet, or simply coinage, if trading in cities with minted currency. Salt was weighed and often cut into smaller blocks. In local markets, women sold salt shavings by the pinch, used in food, medicine, or livestock care. But the real profits came from re-exporting. Salt moved further south to Niger River cities like Jen or Kano, and even into forest regions where it was scarce and deeply valued. Ghana and the tax of passage. Before Mali or Songhai, there was the Empire of Ghana, not located in modern Ghana, but in what is today southeastern Mauritania and western Mali. Active from the 6th to 13th centuries, Ghana controlled key trans-Saharan trade routes. It grew rich not by mining salt or gold, but by taxing their movement. According to Arab chroniclers like al-Bakri, Ghana's kings levied tolls on every loaded donkey and camel entering or leaving, every slab of salt, every bag of gold dust, every bundle of goods. Taxes were collected in kind or in gold. Ghana's wealth was immense. Its rulers dressed in imported silks, employed scribes and guards, and built cities with stone walls and palaces. Yet their empire depended on other people's movement. The desert traders brought salt, southern merchants brought gold. Ghana stood in between and profited from the crossroads. Mali and the reign of Mansa Musa. By the 13th century, Ghana declined, and Mali rose centered along the Niger River, stretching from the Atlantic coast to the heart of the Sahara. Mali's most famous ruler, Mansa Musa, reigned in the early 1300s and is still often cited as the wealthiest person in recorded history. His wealth came largely from control of gold mines in Bambouk and Bur, taxes on the salt and trans-Saharan trade, agricultural surplus from the fertile Niger floodplain. In 1324, Mansa Musa made his famous pilgrimage to Mecca, traveling with thousands of attendants, including scholars, soldiers, and servants, hundreds of camels carrying gold dust. So much gold that he reportedly disrupted economies in Cairo and Medina through oversupply. But his empire's wealth was sustained not by spectacle but by routine. Salt flowed in from the north, gold and grain flowed out, merchants paid taxes, governors oversaw markets, judges enforced contracts. Salt was tracked, inspected, measured. And behind every slab was a long history, from the digger at Taoudeni to the camel guide through Tainsroof to the merchant who weighed it in the market stalls of Timbuktu. The Songhai Empire, organization and expansion. As Mali's power waned, the Songhai Empire rose, dominating the trade routes from the mid-15th to late 16th century. With its capital at Gao, Songhai built an even more centralized and organized trade network. Under rulers like Sunni Ali and Askia Mohammed, Songhai improved roads and secured caravan routes, standardized weights and measures in markets, appointed governors in key trade cities, built warehouses and granaries for storage. Salt remained crucial not only for trade, but as a state resource. Soldiers were often paid in salt, a practice mirrored in parts of the Roman world as well. Askia Mohammed, a devout Muslim, also patronized scholars and judges, ensuring that contracts, trade disputes, and caravan agreements were handled with legal sophistication. In Songhai, the Salt Road had become a bureaucratic artery, pulsing with predictable commerce. But it was still dangerous. Risk and fragility. Despite these powerful empires and the weight of tradition, the salt roads were never easy. Caravans faced banditry, desert raiders could ambush even large groups, drought and shifting dunes, which swallowed paths or wells, political instability, when rulers changed or war erupted, diseases, especially among animals and humans after long exposure. Merchants bought insurance, partnered in trade guilds, and passed down route knowledge through families. Still, the system was fragile. One bad season could break a merchant. One war could sever a route. Salt was sturdy, but the world it supported was delicately balanced. Cultural exchanges along the route. Salt didn't just carry economic weight, it carried culture. As caravans passed through towns and oases, they spread language, including Arabic, Berber, and local dialects. Religion, especially Islam, which spread south via merchants and scholars. Ideas, from jurisprudence to astronomy to poetry. Material culture, textiles, beads, tools, architecture. A trader might return home with salt, gold, and new knowledge: how to calculate lunar phases, how to build in Adobe, how to write contracts. In this way, the Salt Road became a conduit of civilization, linking desert nomads with urban scholars and camel drivers with kings. A living network. For centuries, the Salt Roads endured not because of armies or empires, but because of need and knowledge. They were self-renewing systems, fueled by labor, trust, and repetition. Salt connected not just places but people, the miner and the merchant, the camel driver and the scholar, the desert guide and the city scribe. And in this web, wealth was not measured only in gold, but in roots, relationships, and reputation. A question beneath the dust. So, as we imagine the end of another caravan, dusty camels kneeling, Salt stacked high in the market square, traders negotiating quietly under the shade of woven mats. We must ask, how many of history's richest systems were built not by conquest, but by slow, quiet, mutual movement? For centuries, the salt roads wound through the desert like dry rivers, carving invisible paths through sand, connecting mines with markets and deserts with empires. They shaped West African civilization, sustained cities like Timbuktu, and made fortunes rise in the quiet trade of white stone. But all roads, no matter how enduring, face decline. This final section tells the story of how the salt roads faded from dominance, not with conquest or collapse, but through slow erosion of purpose, of value, and of memory. And it asks, when a road vanishes, what remains? The first cracks, political shifts and fragile control. The first signs of decline were not in the desert, but in the cities that depended on the trade. In the late 16th century, the mighty Songhai Empire fell. Moroccan forces, armed with early firearms, crossed the desert and defeated the Songhai army in 1591 at the Battle of Tondubai. It was a victory on paper, but in practice, Morocco couldn't hold the territory. The empire fractured. Trade cities like Gao, Timbuktu, and Jen were sacked, taxed, and left vulnerable, without a strong central power to protect trade routes, enforce contracts, maintain infrastructure. The reliability of trans-Saharan trade began to erode. Caravans still ran, but less often. The risks increased. Merchants looked for new routes or shifted toward internal trade instead. Meanwhile, something else was rising on the distant coasts, something that would unravel centuries of desert economy. The Atlantic turns the world sideways. By the 17th and 18th centuries, European ships crowded the West African coastline. Portuguese, Dutch, British, and French traders built forts and ports from Senegal to Benin, drawing commerce toward the sea. This Atlantic economy brought new goods, guns, textiles, tobacco, alcohol, and new horrors, most notably the transatlantic slave trade. The coastal pull changed everything. West African rulers now focused their trade outward, toward European merchants. Internal networks, once based on camel trade, lost their primacy. Salt, still important, now came in part from coastal evaporation pans, reducing dependence on desert sources. The Sahara, once a bridge, became a barrier again. Cities like Timbuktu declined, caravans dwindled, and while salt remained vital, it was no longer central to wealth or statecraft. Technology and salt's demotion. As centuries passed, technology changed salt's place in the world. In the 19th and 20th centuries, mechanical refrigeration reduced the need for salt preservation. Industrial salt mining using machines and explosives produced salt faster and cheaper than hand-dug slabs. Railroads and motor vehicles began replacing camels in many trade areas. Even in West Africa, governments began importing cheaper, cleaner refined salt, often iodized and packaged. It entered cities and towns through trucks, not caravans. Suddenly, the gray, rough slabs from Taoudeni looked primitive. Still, they carried a kind of cultural weight. In parts of Mali, Niger, and Mauritania, traditional salt is still valued for taste, ritual use, or symbolism. But its age as currency had ended. Taoudeni, a ghost of trades past. In the far north of Mali, Taoudeni remains active. The salt mines still operate. Men still carve blocks by hand. Camels still carry slabs south to Timbuktu once or twice a year. But it's a shadow of what it once was. The miners live in harsh conditions, no running water, extreme heat, little medical access. The salt blocks fetch only modest prices in local markets. The caravans are now cultural relics, honored for their endurance rather than their necessity. Some journeys are undertaken for tradition, tourism, or symbolic connection to the past. The road is not gone, but its reason has changed. The memory in the sand. Today, if you walk the desert, you'll find no carved milestones or ruined caravanserais. The salt road left no buildings, no statues, and few inscriptions. Its traces are found in oral histories passed down among Tuareg and Berber guides, songs and proverbs speaking of salt's value and the silence of the desert, old contracts and traveler accounts preserved in libraries or family chests, cultural memory, where salt still holds a place in ritual, diet, and trade. And yet it shaped entire civilizations. Because history is not only made by what is built, but by what is carried. The weight of the invisible. When we remember empires, we often remember monuments. The salt roads of the Sahara left few, but they moved millions of tons of material across thousands of miles through some of the harshest conditions on Earth. They made Timbuktu a center of learning, Mali the wealthiest empire of its time, desert nomads into economic power brokers, all without stone walls or iron armies. The road's endurance came from knowledge, trust, and need, and while those may not leave grand ruins, they leave lasting structures in culture. Final reflection. Salt never glittered. It wasn't worn in crowns or set in jewelry. But it preserved life. It fed armies. It underwrote economies. It moved silently, like the desert itself, present, essential, and easy to overlook. So as we close this story, consider this. How many of history's greatest engines ran not on glory or conquest, but on quiet, daily need and the long, slow steps of those who moved through emptiness carrying nothing but white stones. Story 7. The Ice Trade, when frozen lakes supplied the tropics. Imagine a time before refrigeration, before ice trays, freezers, or industrial cooling systems. A time when, in most of the world, ice was a miracle, ephemeral, rare, a novelty enjoyed only by the elite, if at all. Now imagine that ice, carved from frozen lakes in New England, was shipped thousands of miles by sailing ships, packed in sawdust and hope, destined for plantations in the Caribbean, palaces in Calcutta, and even the tropical ports of Singapore. This is the story of the ice trade, a forgotten industry that, for a few decades in the 19th century, turned winter into profit, silence into labor, and still lakes into global commerce. It is not a tale of glory or revolution. It is a tale of careful harvesting, insulated crates, and weather watching. A story made of crystal, melting even as it traveled. And it begins with a man named Frederick Tudor, standing on the edge of a Massachusetts pond in 1806, watching his dream take shape in the form of thick, clear ice. The problem of heat and the dream of cold. In the early 1800s, refrigeration was unknown. Fresh meats spoiled quickly. Milk turned sour. Cold drinks were luxuries enjoyed only during the brief winters of temperate zones. The wealthy in warmer climates longed for cooling relief to preserve food, soothe fevered patients, or chill drinks in a sweltering afternoon. Frederick Tudor, a young Boston merchant from a well-off family, saw opportunity in discomfort. He believed there would be enormous demand for ice in the tropics. His idea was simple. Harvest ice from frozen New England lakes and ponds in winter. Insulate it with sawdust, a waste product from sawmills. Load it into cargo holds of ships. Deliver it to places like Cuba, Jamaica, or India, where it would be sold for profit. At the time, many thought him mad. Ice melts, after all. But Tudor would become known as the Ice King, and his vision would shape a quiet but extraordinary industry. Harvesting ice, a winter ritual. Every winter, as ponds and lakes froze thick 8, 10, 12 inches, crews would descend with tools, horses, and wagons. The process was precise. Scoring the ice, men marked the surface into grids using sharp-toothed saws. Initially, this was done by hand. Later, horse-drawn cutters carved channels efficiently. Cutting blocks. Using long saws or ice plows, blocks were separated along the grid lines. Floating to shore. The cut blocks were pushed along open water lanes to the shoreline, where they were lifted out with ice tongs. Storing blocks were stacked in ice houses, insulated with sawdust. These ice houses were often massive, holding thousands of tons of ice. Ice cutting was dangerous, cold, and labor-intensive. Men worked in sub-zero temperatures, soaked and freezing. Falls through the ice were common. Horses drowned. Fingers were lost. But the work was valuable. An experienced crew could cut and store hundreds of tons per day, and ice, though cheap in the north, was worth many times more in the south. Sawdust, the unsung hero. Without insulation, the trade would have been impossible. The solution: sawdust, available in abundance from New England's thriving lumber industry. Sawdust was cheap and easy to pack, absorbent, reducing meltwater, effective, creating layers of dead air that slowed heat transfer. Blocks were stacked with several inches of sawdust between them, both in ice houses and in ship holds. The result: even after a month at sea, as much as 2/3 of the cargo might arrive intact. Sawdust, a waste product, became the key to preserving what would otherwise disappear before it reached the docks. The ships carrying frost to fire. Ice was a strange cargo. It had to be loaded last, so as not to crush other goods. It required ventilation to avoid pooling meltwater and rot. It demanded speed, meaning only certain ships, fast schooners or brigs, were used. Ships departed Boston, Salem, or Newburyport in the depth of winter, bound for Charleston, New Orleans, Havana, and eventually Rio de Janeiro, Madras, and Calcutta. The captains carried careful logs. Internal temperature, quantity loaded, rate of melt, port conditions. Upon arrival, the blocks were transferred to local ice houses, also insulated, often operated by agents or partners of the Tudor enterprise. In some cities, like Savannah or New Orleans, ice deliveries were events locals gathered at the docks to see the miracle of frozen water arriving from thousands of miles away. Calcutta, the farthest reach. Perhaps the most extraordinary destination was India. In 1833, Frederick Tudor successfully shipped ice to Calcutta, over 16,000 miles away, around the Cape of Good Hope. The voyage took over 4 months. Yet when the ship arrived, 100 tons of ice remained. It was received with astonishment. The British colonial elite welcomed it eagerly. Ice baths, chilled wine, and medical use became status symbols. Hospitals received shipments for fever patients. Calcutta's tropical climate made it one of Tudor's most profitable markets. Eventually, Tudor and his partners constructed large ice houses in the city. These became fixtures of British colonial life. In India, where there was no natural ice, the arrival of frozen blocks from across the world was a quiet marvel of logistics and endurance. A boring but essential commodity. Despite its glamour in elite circles, most of the ice went to practical uses: preserving fish and meat during transport, cooling milk and cream to prevent spoilage, making confections or drinks more palatable, reducing fever and inflammation in hospitals. In cities like Boston or New York, ice became a working-class necessity. Deliverymen, icemen, carried blocks from wagons into homes and businesses. But in the tropics, where ice was less accessible, its arrival meant status, comfort, and health. And all of this started with men cutting frozen ponds with saws, watching their breath cloud in the morning air. An unlikely industry built on silence and slowness. The ice trade was never fast. It was a game of margins and patience. Wait for lakes to freeze. Cut and store carefully. Pack ships with precision. Hope for fair weather. Monitor melt losses. rebuild the ice house at the other end. Repeat. There were no guarantees. A mild winter could ruin supply. A delayed ship meant loss. Port taxes or dock disputes could collapse a year's profit. And yet, for over half a century, it worked. From frozen New England to the sweating tropics, a commodity that melted slowly in silence became one of the century's most improbable industries. A thought in the meltwater. As the ships disappeared into humid harbors and the ice houses filled, one wonders, what does it mean when entire economies are built on something that, by its nature, is always disappearing? The last time we left the ice, it had just arrived miraculously intact on the steamy docks of Calcutta and Havana. Cut from frozen New England lakes and carried by ship across oceans, it was more than a novelty. It was relief, prestige, power. But behind the blocks of ice, sweating in sawdust and shadow, stood an unlikely figure. Frederick Tudor, Boston merchant turned global coal tycoon. In this section, we follow the rise of Tudor's ice empire, how it was built, challenged, and maintained. We see how ice became not just a product but a system, with its own rules, rhythms, and consequences. And how, in the end, it faced challenges not from competition but from invention. Frederick Tudor, the Ice King's unlikely rise. Frederick Tudor was not an inventor. He was not a shipbuilder or a scientist. He was a businessman driven, stubborn, and visionary. Born into wealth in 1783, he might have lived a comfortable life. Instead, at age 22, he gambled everything on a strange idea, shipping New England ice to the Caribbean. His first voyage in 1806 was a disaster. The ice melted faster than expected. Port officials in Martinique taxed it heavily. Local demand was lukewarm. He lost money. But Tudor persisted. He learned from his mistakes. He began using sawdust for insulation. He invested in better ships and faster loading techniques. He targeted wealthy urban centers where novelty carried value. By the 1820s, Tudor had profitable routes to Savannah, Charleston, New Orleans, and Havana. In the 1830s, he reached Brazil and India. He became known as the Ice King, and his success inspired imitators. Building the ice empire, Tudor's business grew into a vast logistical network involving ice cutters in towns like Wenham and Fresh Pond, Massachusetts, teamsters to haul ice from lakes to insulated warehouses, ship captains and brokers, often under strict contracts, local agents in southern and foreign ports, icehouse builders and managers around the world. He invested in infrastructure, especially icehouses, which served as receiving and storage depots. Massive structures, sometimes 30 feet tall, with double walls and thick sawdust insulation. Built in hot cities like Havana, New Orleans, Kingston, and Calcutta. Some operated year-round, selling ice in small blocks to hotels, hospitals, bars, and wealthy households. Tudor even licensed his ice houses to other traders, collecting rents and fees. The trade became systematized. Schedules were set to match seasonal freezes and global shipping lanes. Ice was cut in January and February, shipped from March to May, and sold through the year. The labor behind the ice. This empire rested on the backs of thousands of men. In the North, ice cutters, often working-class immigrants, endured bitter temperatures, icy water, and long days. Drivers and haulers moved heavy loads by wagon, often across frozen terrain. Warehousemen stacked ice in dark, freezing sheds, breathing sawdust and cold air. At sea, sailors and captains risked storms, rot, and pirates. Ice cargo was unstable, slippery, wet, heavy, and could damage ships if not packed well. In the tropics, dock workers handled dripping, slippery cargo. Local sellers, often enslaved or indentured workers, carried blocks to hospitals, households, and shops. And while the products served the wealthy, the work was often thankless and dangerous. Competitors and innovations. As Tudor's model succeeded, others entered the market. Companies formed in Maine, where lakes froze thick and labor was cheap. The Kennebec River region became a rival source of ice, shipping to New York and beyond. Some firms specialized in higher quality ice, known as crystal ice, efficient harvesting tools, such as rotating cutters and mechanical lifts, branded blocks, stamped with origin names like Wenham Lake Ice. The industry became competitive. Ice was sold not just for utility, but for status. In London and Calcutta, people paid more for ice from certain lakes, reputed to be cleaner and purer. Even scientists joined in, experimenting with ice preservation, alternative insulation, and improved shipping techniques. But the success of the trade still depended on weather. A warm winter could ruin the harvest. A late freeze might cancel the season. It was a natural industry at the mercy of cycles beyond control. Global reach and cultural impact. By the 1850s, the ice trade had global reach. 50,000 tons of ice were being shipped from Boston to the American South each year. Another 30,000 plus tons went to the Caribbean and South America. Thousands of tons went around the world to ports in Asia. In India, ice transformed colonial life. It cooled the drinks of the British elite. Hospitals began to store ice for medical use, particularly for heat stroke and surgical procedures. Ice became associated with modernity, civility, and refinement. In the American South, ice was used to preserve fish and meats in urban markets, cool milk and butter in hot summers, serve chilled drinks in saloons and hotels. It entered the culture in quiet ways through recipes, rituals, and medical practice. But this reach came at a price: labor, risk, and time. The ice trade was always melting, always receding. And soon it would be overtaken. The first threat: artificial ice. As early as the 1840s, inventors experimented with mechanical refrigeration. In 1851, Dr. John Gorey patented an early ice-making machine to cool hospital patients in Florida. In the 1870s, industrial systems began producing artificial ice for breweries and meatpackers. At first, it was more expensive and less trusted. People believed artificial ice was unclean or unhealthy. But over time, as technology improved, artificial ice became cheaper and more reliable. It could be made year-round, anywhere, and in predictable quantities. It didn't require shipping, insulation, or a cold winter. By the 1890s, artificial ice plants appeared in southern cities, India, and even Africa, undercutting the long, slow work of the northern harvest. The empire of the Ice King began to shrink not from competition, but from invention. A system melting from within. By the turn of the 20th century, ice shipments from New England had plummeted. Many ice houses fell into disuse, their timbers rotting and their names forgotten. The laborers moved on to railroads, factories, or new industries. The lakes still froze, but the world had moved on. Only a few blocks of natural ice made it to tropical shores in the 1900s, more as novelty than necessity. A thought between seasons. The ice trade lasted less than a century, but it transformed how people ate, healed, and endured heat. It built systems that crossed oceans and connected climates, all based on something as fleeting as frozen water. And so, as the last sailing ship loaded its cargo of melting blocks and turned its bow southward, the question remains: how much of history is made not by what endures, but by what is designed to disappear? We have followed the frozen blocks from their still beginnings on a New England pond, to distant harbors glistening with sweat, to the tables and hospitals of cities far removed from winter's touch. We've met the workers, the merchants, and the machines that kept the system alive and eventually made it obsolete. Now we turn to the final stretch of this story. Not a collapse, but a quiet melt. Not an explosion, but an evaporation. The last section of the ice trade story is a meditation on what happens to infrastructure built on the fleeting, how the rhythms of a disappearing industry echo far beyond its physical end, and how our modern world still bears traces of these cold blocks and warm hands. A changing climate of commerce and thought. The ice trade, as we've seen, did not die all at once. Even as mechanical refrigeration crept in and new industries arose, ice from frozen lakes still held some value in the late 19th century. But then the tempo shifted quickly. Key forces. Railroads allowed more precise deliveries of artificial ice inland. Steamships made long-haul shipments faster and favored goods with greater profit margins than melting blocks. Urban density increased the demand for dependable refrigeration, not something tied to seasons. And most significantly, technology became personal. By the early 20th century, refrigeration moved into homes, first as ice boxes, replenished by deliverymen with either natural or artificial ice. Later, as electric refrigerators, slowly entering wealthier households and eventually becoming standard fixtures. No longer did people need to wait for the ice wagon or calculate how long their butter would last in a warm kitchen. The convenience was quiet but profound. The ice trade's grand global networks became redundant. Within a generation, what had once taken 16,000 miles to deliver from Boston to Calcutta could now be produced on site, with a button and a hum. The Iceman's last rounds. For some time, the ice delivery business outlived the trade that created it. In the U.S., ice men became familiar figures. With leather aprons and iron tongs, they hoisted 25 or 50-pound blocks over shoulders, climbing stairs to load ice boxes in kitchens. Children would chase the wagons in summer, hopping for chips of ice. Many households posted signs in their windows, 25, 50, or 75, indicating how many pounds were needed that day. But even this faded. By the 1940s and 50s, household electric refrigeration became affordable for the middle class. Ice men disappeared. Ice houses were torn down or converted. The last generation to grow up waiting for the ice wagon became the first to reach into a freezer whenever they liked. And with that, the long road from frozen pond to tropical port came to an end. Ghost in the ice house. What happened to the infrastructure? Ice ponds were often abandoned. Some became recreational lakes, others filled with silt and vanished from maps. Warehouses crumbled. A few were preserved or converted into museums or storage for other goods. Shipping lines adapted, carrying other cargo or retired their ships. Tudor's ice houses, once marvels in Havana and Calcutta, were slowly dismantled or left to weather away. In places like Fresh Pond, Cambridge, MA, you can still walk around the lake where millions of pounds of ice were harvested annually. Interpretive signs tell you what once stood on the banks. The water still freezes each winter, but no one cuts it. The silence remains, different now, less busy, more reflective. What was lost? It's tempting to look at the ice trade as a romantic footnote, a quaint, labor-intensive prelude to our sleek, digital modernity. But it carried with it a logic we've largely forgotten. That supply chains were seasonal, not instant. That perishability required planning, not just packaging. That value could be found in ordinary, natural things like frozen water. That entire industries could exist based on weather and patience. It was boring, yes, but it was also deeply human. The sound of saws on a pond in January, the smell of pine sawdust packed between layers of ice, the creak of wooden ships moving through tropical heat with something cold hidden below. and the knowledge passed silently from laborer to laborer of how to stack, measure, and insulate something that was always, inevitably, melting. The legacy in the cold. Today we take cold for granted. Refrigerators hum, ice clinks in glasses, supermarket freezer aisles offer endless choices. But the logistics of cold, what it means to create, move, and preserve it, are still a part of life. Vaccine transport during pandemics relies on cold chain management, a direct descendant of the ice trade's principles. Global shipping of perishables from sushi-grade tuna to fresh roses requires insulated containers, thermal monitoring, and efficiency. And climate control, in everything from data centers to agricultural storage, depends on systems that once began with simply cutting a block from a pond. The ice trade showed us that cold is not just the absence of heat, it's a resource, a service, a commodity. One that shaped the modern world quietly and largely forgotten. Final reflection. Frederick Tudor once stood at the edge of a frozen pond and imagined a world where something ephemeral could be made valuable, even essential. He imagined that the most fleeting substance, ice, could be harvested, stored, shipped, sold, and remembered. And for a time he was right. But all ice melts, and all systems built on its preservation must either evolve or disappear. So as you sip something cold from your fridge or pass by a pond in winter, ask yourself, how many forgotten hands made the modern world possible by mastering what was never meant to last? Story 8. Beekeeping in Ancient Egypt. Honey, Labor, and Empire. Imagine drifting quietly down the Nile some 4,000 years ago. Papyrus reeds rustle at the water's edge. Date palms sway in the warm wind. In the distance, the low hum of insects rides the air, gentle but persistent. That sound, if you listened closely, was more than background noise. It was the rhythm of a carefully maintained economy, a soft signal of order and productivity. You were hearing bees. And in ancient Egypt, bees were not merely wild insects or symbols of fertility. They were workers, central to one of the world's oldest industries. Their product, honey, was more than a sweetener. It was currency, medicine, tribute, and sacred offering. This story begins not with a pharaoh or a war, but with clay hives, buzzing courtyards, and human hands, managing a relationship with insects that would last thousands of years. Honey before sugar, a priceless commodity. To understand ancient beekeeping, you must first understand honey's role in a time before refined sugar existed. In ancient Egypt, honey was the only native sweetener widely available, a preservative used to store fruit and embalm meat, medicine applied to wounds, mixed with herbs or taken to ease digestive issues, a sacred offering presented to gods in temples and placed in tombs, a luxury good often reserved for elites and royalty. Because of this, beekeeping was a hobby. It was a state-sanctioned enterprise, organized, monitored, and taxed like grain or linen. Bees were not only buzzing around flowers, they were buzzing inside the economic systems of one of the most sophisticated civilizations of the ancient world. The bee as a symbol of power. Even the pharaohs paid attention. The bee appears as a royal symbol as early as Egypt's first dynasty, around 3100 BCE. Kings carried the title, he of the sedge and the bee, symbolizing control over both Upper and Lower Egypt. This wasn't just poetic language. It reflected a vision of total order where even the insects were within the scope of the pharaoh's divine mandate. To rule Egypt was to rule grain, floodwaters, cattle, and bees, clay hives and riverbank apiaries. Unlike the wooden box hives familiar today, Egyptian beekeepers used horizontal clay cylinders, stacked in rows like logs. Each hive was roughly 3 to 4 feet long, narrow and sealed at one end, open at the other for bees to enter and exit. These hives were placed horizontally, in shaded, quiet areas, often stacked in rows, forming small apiary walls. Located near riverbanks or irrigation channels where flowers grew, beekeepers tended to entire bee villages, managing dozens or hundreds of hives. When it came time to harvest, smoke was blown into the hive's entrance to calm the bees. The back end was opened and the honeycombs carefully removed. Honey and wax were separated using strainers or hands. It was delicate work. Too much disturbance and a hive might flee, too little and production would stall. Beekeepers, an organized class of laborers. The Egyptians left behind detailed records not just about kings and battles, but about beekeeping. In tomb paintings and inscriptions, we find images of beekeepers tending hives, sometimes surrounded by reeds or wildflowers. Instructions for managing bees, including smoking them, harvesting comb, and storing honey. References to beekeepers as a specialized role, with titles like Sealer of the Honey or Overseer of Beekeepers. These weren't random farmers with a few hives. They were part of organized labor teams, likely working on state-run estates, temple grounds, or noble holdings. Beekeepers had to understand seasonal flower cycles, hive behavior, including swarming and queen selection, storage and preservation of honey in clay jars, protection both from predators and from thieves. Honey was valuable. In some cases, it was used to pay taxes or offered in tribute. A missing jar was a matter of concern, not just for the beekeeper, but for the entire estate. Temple honey and offerings to the gods. Much of Egypt's honey went not to homes, but to temples. Gods such as Ra, Osiris, and Neith were frequently offered honey. As part of daily rituals, poured into libation vessels. In funerary rites, to preserve and anoint bodies. Mixed with wine, beer, or milk for sacred feasts. Priests oversaw storage in sealed jars, often labeled with origin, date, and purpose. In many tombs, archaeologists have uncovered still-preserved honey, sealed for millennia. Honey's natural antimicrobial properties allow it to last almost indefinitely, meaning some of Egypt's offerings remain intact to this day. Honey wasn't just food, it was permanence in a world of change. Wax, larvae, and other byproducts. While honey was the star, the entire hive was useful. Beeswax was used in medicine, mummification, and sealing documents. Bee larvae could be eaten, though not commonly noted. It may have served as emergency protein. Wax also played a role in ritual candles, amulets, and cosmetics. Nothing was wasted. Even dead bees might be swept into compost or used in traditional remedies. The relationship was not sentimental, it was pragmatic, but it was also respectful. The bees were understood as part of the natural and sacred order, linked to the fertility of the land and the blessings of the gods. A river of sweetness in a harsh world. Why does this matter? Because in a harsh climate, dry, flood-prone, unpredictable, honey offered something rare: stability. It did not spoil. It could be stored and transported. It was compact, versatile, and durable. And in a world where sweetness was hard to come by, it offered both pleasure and value. Honey was eaten with bread, mixed into cakes and pastes, used in beer production, rubbed on wounds or ulcers, offered to the gods, to the dead, to the pharaoh himself. And it all began with the hum of wings along the reeds and the quiet labor of a beekeeper in the early light. An unanswered buzz. We've seen how honey was harvested, stored, offered, and taxed. We've seen how hives were built and guarded, how wax sealed scrolls and sweetened rituals. But one question remains. What happened when the bees failed to return? Was it bad weather, poor placement, a mismanaged hive, a spiritual imbalance? We don't yet know. But in the next section, we'll look at the risks and rituals of beekeeping in Egypt, what happened when the system didn't work, and how the empire responded. The low hum of bees was once as much a sign of order in ancient Egypt as the flooding of the Nile or the rising of the morning sun. But like the river's waters, the behavior of bees could change. Sometimes, the bees would not return. Sometimes hives would go quiet. And in a society that prized harmony, that silence was more than a nuisance, it was a warning. This section explores the vulnerabilities of Egypt's beekeeping system. From hive collapse and seasonal shifts to religious omens and administrative failures, we look into the fragility behind the buzzing order. And we explore how the Egyptians responded to failure not with panic, but with ritual, record-keeping, and reform. For in the ancient world, a good beekeeper was not just a laborer. He was also a priest, a scientist, and an accountant, sometimes all at once. Climate and the bee. Ancient Egypt's reliance on predictable patterns made the failure of those patterns especially devastating. The Nile flood provided silt and irrigation. The sun structured daily rhythms. The bees, in their own way, were expected to follow nature's clock. But nature does not always cooperate. Potential disruptions included poor flowering seasons. If Nile floods were too low, the wild flora along its banks did not thrive. Bees, lacking forage, abandoned hives or died. Extreme heat and drought. Though bees are desert-adapted, extended dry spells made water and nectar scarce. Predators and parasites. Birds, beetles, and mites may have attacked hives. Improper hive management. Overharvesting honey or smoke misuse could weaken a colony. The result, colony collapse, hive abandonment, production losses. In modern terms, it was a supply chain failure. In ancient terms, it may have been read as a spiritual imbalance, a sign that something in the social or natural order had gone wrong. Administrative eyes on the apiary. Beekeeping was a bureaucratically tracked activity in Egypt. From the Old Kingdom to the Ptolemaic period, we find tally marks of honey jars in temple records, scrolls detailing quotas from estate apiaries, inspectors assigned to oversee beekeepers and verify deliveries. In larger temple estates, hives were part of an accounting network with recorded inputs, honey, wax, and outputs, offerings, payments, shipments. If a hive failed, the loss wasn't just agricultural, it was recorded and explained. Consider, was the beekeeper at fault? Was the land failing? Was the temple's ritual schedule disrupted? In a system that depended on predictability, loss of yield would be investigated not only for practical reasons, but because it disrupted ritual balance with the gods. Beekeeping and ritual purity. We know that many Egyptian trades were linked to ritual cleanliness. Just as scribes washed before writing, and priests shaved their bodies before entering temples, beekeepers likely followed procedures to ensure purity, especially when handling offerings bound for the gods. Honey was considered a pure substance, linked to rebirth, healing, and divine taste. Symbolically connected to Ra, the sun god, who was sometimes said to sweat bees. Used in ritual mixtures, such as incense, ointments, and funerary preparations. A failed hive might not only mean a shortage of product, it might mean that something in the cosmic balance had faltered. In extreme cases, a significant collapse could prompt ceremonial cleansing of the apiary site, ritual offerings to restore fertility, consultation with temple priests for omens or interpretations. We do not have direct instructions for what to do when the bees vanish, but from adjacent agricultural practices, we can infer that ritual and logic coexisted in the Egyptian response to failure. The queen bee and social order. Interestingly, ancient Egyptians likely did not understand the concept of a queen bee. They referred to the king bee in inscriptions and texts. Bee societies were thought of in monarchical terms, but through a male lens. This misunderstanding did not prevent effective beekeeping, but it speaks to the symbolic overlay placed on nature bees as models of order, loyalty, hierarchy. So when that hierarchy broke down, when a hive absconded or turned violent, it may have been read as a social metaphor. Was a human authority being challenged? Was there unrest in the land or the temple? Was Ma'at cosmic balance disturbed? Bees were not just insects, they were mirrors of the state, and their health reflected more than botany. Rebuilding the swarm. When a hive failed, Egyptian beekeepers had options primitive but effective. Restoring a colony may have involved capturing wild swarms, especially during spring, when bees naturally split. Relocating hives, following water sources and seasonal blooms. Creating new hives, seeded with wax and attractants. Feeding colonies, using dates or diluted honey to sustain bees through lean times. These techniques were passed down not through textbooks, but through oral knowledge, apprenticeship, and daily observation. A good beekeeper watched not only the bees, but the flowers, the weather, the Nile's moods, the shadows of falcons who preyed upon buzzing wings. He, or possibly she, we lack clear records of gender roles here, was a practitioner of pattern, living on the thin edge between predictability and improvisation. Honey's political weight. When honey production dropped, the effects could ripple outward. Temple rituals were adjusted or delayed. Royal demands went unmet. Trade agreements, especially with Nubian or Near Eastern entities, may have suffered. Public perception of prosperity could shift. There is some evidence that honey, like grain, was part of tax systems in certain periods. A local administrator whose province failed to meet honey quotas might face scrutiny from higher officials. Though not as central as wheat or cattle, honey's value was disproportionately high for medicine, priestly function, elite consumption, export and tribute. A bad bee year was not a small concern. It was a crack in the polished limestone of state control. The sweetness of recovery. Despite the challenges, the system endured for centuries. Egypt's beekeepers were adaptable. Hives were moved seasonally. Wild bees were enticed with wax. Trade routes shifted to secure alternate sources. And in time, the bees often returned. The silence of the hives would again become a hum. Honey would fill jars. Offerings would resume. The rituals, briefly disrupted, would continue as if uninterrupted. This resilience was not miraculous, it was structured. A blend of natural observation, ritual framework, and labor knowledge. And it offers a quiet lesson. Systems built on fragility must learn to bend, not break. A buzz in the archives. As we move toward the final section of this story, we begin to consider, how far did this legacy reach? Beekeeping survived the fall of the New Kingdom. It continued under Greek and Roman rule. It entered Coptic and Islamic Egypt, where bees still worked the Nile valleys. But over time, the methods changed. Wooden hives replaced clay ones. Sugarcane supplanted honey as the chief sweetener. The bee lost its monopoly. Still, in museums and tombs, the evidence remains. Clay hives, sealed honey jars, wall paintings of buzzing courtyards, names of officials whose job titles include honey inspector. The system may be gone, but its outline still lingers. A question beneath the wax. So much of Egypt's splendor is built on hard stone temples, statues, pyramids. But this story reminds us that another kind of labor shaped the empire, fragile, seasonal, insect-dependent. So as we prepare to conclude the story in the next section, consider, what does it mean that one of the most powerful civilizations in history entrusted part of its sacred economy to the whims of bees? By now, we've followed the bees from their clay homes along the Nile to the temples, storerooms, and tombs of the pharaohs. We've watched as keepers harvested honey in ritual silence, calculated quotas, and soothed swarms with smoke. We've seen what happened when the hives fell silent and how the ancient world responded with resilience, ritual, and reform. Now, in this final section, we follow the echoes. We look not only at what happened to Egypt's beekeeping traditions after the pharaohs, but how their legacy persisted, not in monuments or conquest, but in small, enduring practices passed from hand to hand, hive to hive. We close not with collapse, but with a hum that carries forward still. After the pharaohs, honey in Hellenistic and Roman Egypt. By the time Alexander the Great entered Egypt in 332 BCE, the ancient traditions were already thousands of years old, but beekeeping survived the political changes. Under the Ptolemies and Romans, clay hives remained in use, but began to evolve in shape and arrangement. Greek and Roman authors such as Pliny the Elder mentioned Egyptian honey as especially fine. Temple offerings continued, now blending Greco-Egyptian deities and practices. Beekeeping was increasingly linked with private estates, sometimes producing for commercial sale rather than just ritual use. Egypt became a honey-exporting province, shipping sweet goods to the wider Roman Empire. But something deeper shifted. While honey remained valuable, the arrival of sugarcane cultivation in the Mediterranean would, over centuries, challenge its primacy as the world's dominant sweetener. The bees, however, kept working. From Nile to Quran, the Islamic continuation. With the Arab conquest of Egypt in the 7th century CE, beekeeping once again adapted. The Quran contains a notable verse about bees. And your Lord inspired the bee. Build your homes in the mountains, the trees, and in what people construct. From their bellies comes a drink of varying color in which there is healing for people. Surah An-Nahl 16, 68-69. This verse elevated honey as a divinely ordained healing substance, encouraging its continued use and production across the Islamic world. In Islamic Egypt, beekeeping was maintained, often in rural communities. Honey was used in medicine, confectionery, and religious ritual. Manuals on beekeeping and honey's properties were written by scholars and physicians. The symbolic value of honey as purity, healing, and sweetness was carried into poetry and scripture. Though sugar grew increasingly common in elite cuisine, honey remained the flavor of tradition. Modern echoes, beekeeping today in Egypt. In rural Egypt today, particularly in the Nile Delta and Upper Egypt, beekeeping continues modernized but not unrecognizable. Modern Egyptian apiarists use box hives modeled on European standards. Move hives seasonally to follow flowering crops like clover and citrus. Harvest and sell honey in local markets, often unfiltered and raw. Still rely on ancestral knowledge, passed within families or among neighbors. And though few now use clay tube hives, the memory lingers. In some rural communities, older apiaries, abandoned or decorative, still show rows of hollowed mud brick hives, their mouths long sealed, their insides silent. They are ghosts of a golden hum. Waxing symbolism, bees in culture and language. Even as practical beekeeping changed, the bee's symbolic role endured. The bee remains a metaphor for industriousness in Egyptian, Arabic, and folklore. Honey continues to be a gift of blessing for births, marriages, and healing. In some parts of the Middle East and North Africa, bees are still regarded as sacred creatures, protected from harm. Egyptian Arabic still carries idioms like "as sweet as honey," and honey continues to be part of Eid feasts, wedding cakes, and herbal medicine. The bee survived not as monument, but as metaphor and material. Honey's scientific endurance. In modern laboratories, honey from Egyptian tombs has been tested and confirmed as chemically intact after thousands of years. Though not palatable by modern standards, the honey remains sterile and unspoiled thanks to low moisture. high acidity, natural hydrogen peroxide production, storage in sealed, airtight containers. This chemical durability became an unintentional time capsule. Few other ancient foods have endured so completely, not bread, not meat, not oil. Only honey, sealed by bees in silence. From laborers to legacy. The names of Egypt's ancient beekeepers are mostly lost. We know they existed because their tools survive. Wall paintings showing the process. Inscriptions listing honey taxes. Sealed jars bearing delivery counts. Tombs with miniature clay hives included as part of the deceased's property. These were not kings, not generals, not priests of renown. But their work sustained the gods, soothed the wounded, and sweetened the daily life of one of history's most enduring civilizations. They labored in the background, quietly, daily. Like bees. Final reflection, the weight of sweetness. When we imagine Egyptian greatness, we often think of scale pyramids, monuments, rivers. But sometimes, a civilization's strength rests not in what it builds high, but in what it cultivates quietly. A small insect, a clay cylinder, a jar of golden sweetness, and the unseen hands that carried the hive through centuries. So the next time you taste honey spread on bread, stirred into tea, or added to medicine, consider this. You are partaking in a tradition older than writing, rooted in labor, ritual, and reverence. A sweetness so durable, it outlived its keepers, its temples, and its kings.